Chapter 55 of 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 55. Happy as a Prince. At the very moment he was about entering the chateau, Bragelonne met De Guiche. But before having been met by Raoul, De Guiche had met Manicamp, who had met Malicorne. How was it that Malicorne had met Manicamp? Nothing more simple, for he had awaited his return from Mass, where he had accompanied Monsieur de Saint Aignan. When they met, they congratulated each other upon their good fortune, and Manicamp availed himself of the circumstance to ask his friend if he had not a few crowns still remaining at the bottom of his pocket. The latter, without expressing any surprise at the question, which he perhaps expected, answered that every pocket which is always being drawn upon without anything ever being put in it, resembles those wells which supply water during the winter, but which gardeners render useless by exhausting during the summer; that his, Malicorne's, pocket certainly was deep, and that there would be a pleasure in drawing on it in times of plenty, but that, unhappily, abuse had produced barrenness. To this remark, Manicamp, deep in thought, had replied, "Quite true." "The question, then, is how to fill it," Malicorne added. "Of course, but in what way?" "Nothing easier, my dear Monsieur Manicamp." "So much the better. How?" "A post in Monsieur's household, and the pocket is full again." "You have the post?" "That is, I have the promise of being nominated." "Well!" "Yes, but the promise of nomination, without the post itself, is like a purse with no money in it." "Quite true," Manicamp replied a second time. "Let us try for the post, then." The candidate had persisted. "My dear fellow," sighed Manicamp, "an appointment in his Royal Highness's household is one of the gravest difficulties of our position." "Oh, oh!" "There is no question that, at the present moment, we cannot ask Monsieur for anything." "Why so?" "Because we are not on good terms with him." "A great absurdity, too," said Malicorne, promptly. "Bah! And if we were to show Madame any attention," said Manicamp, "frankly speaking, do you think we should please Monsieur?" "Precisely. If we show Madame any attention, and do it adroitly, Monsieur ought to adore us." "Hum!" "Either that, or we are great fools. Make haste, therefore, Monsieur Manicamp, you who are so able a politician, and make Monsieur de Guiche and his Royal Highness friendly again." "Tell me, what did Monsieur de Saint Aignan tell you, Malicorne?" "Tell me? Nothing. He asked me several questions, and that was all." "Well, was he less discreet, then, with me?" "What did he tell you?" "That the king is passionately in love with Mademoiselle de la Valliere." "We knew that already," replied Malicorne, ironically, "and everybody talks about it loud enough for all to know it. But in the meantime, do what I advise you. Speak to Monsieur de Guiche, and endeavor to get him to make advances to Monsieur. Deuce take it, he owes his Royal Highness that, at least." "But we must see De Guiche, then." "There does not seem to be any great difficulty in that. Try to see him in the same way I tried to see you. Wait for him. You know that he is naturally very fond of walking." "Yes, but whereabouts does he walk?" "What a question to ask! Do you not know that he is in love with Madame?" "So it is said." "Very well. You will find him walking about on the side of the chateau where her apartments are." "Stay, my dear Malicorne, you are not mistaken, for here he is coming." "Why should I be mistaken? Have you ever noticed that I am in the habit of making a mistake? Come, we only need to understand each other. Are you in want of money?" "Ah, exclaimed Manicamp, mournfully. "Well, I want my appointment. Let Malicorne have the appointment, and Manicamp shall have the money. There is no greater difficulty in the way than that." "Very well. In that case make yourself easy. I will do my best." "Do." De Guiche approached, Malicorne stepped aside, and Manicamp caught hold of De Guiche, who was thoughtful and melancholy. "Tell me, my dear comte, what rhyme you were trying to find," said Manicamp. "I have an excellent one to match yours, particularly if yours ends in ain." De Guiche shook his head, and recognizing a friend, he took him by the arm. "My dear Manicamp," he said, "I am in search of something very different from a rhyme. What is it you are looking for?" "You will help me to find what I am in search of," continued the comte. "You who are such an idle fellow, in other words, a man with a mind full of ingenious devices." "I am getting my ingenuity ready, then, my dear comte." "This is the state of the case, then. I wish to approach a particular house where I have some business." "You must get near the house, then," said Manicamp. "Very good. But in this house dwells a husband who happens to be jealous." "Is he more jealous than the dog Cerberus?" "Not more, but quite as much so." "Has he 3 mouths, as that obdurate guardian of the infernal regions had? Do not shrug your shoulders, my dear comte. I put the question to you with an excellent reason, since poets pretend that, in order to soften Monsieur Cerberus, the visitor must take something enticing with him, a cake, for instance. Therefore I, who view the matter in a prosaic light, that is to say in the light of reality, I say, 1 cake is very little for 3 mouths. If your jealous husband has 3 mouths, comte, get 3 cakes." "Manicamp, I can get such advice as that from Monsieur de Beautru." "In order to get better advice," said Manicamp, with a comical seriousness of expression, "you will be obliged to adopt a more precise formula than you have used towards me." "If Raoul were here," said De Guiche, "he would be sure to understand me." "So I think, particularly if you said to him, 'I should very much like to see Madame a little nearer, but I fear Monsieur, because he is jealous.'" "Manicamp!" cried the comte, angrily, and endeavoring to overwhelm his tormentor by a look, who did not, however, appear to be in the slightest degree disturbed by it. "What is the matter now, my dear comte?" inquired Manicamp. "What, is it thus you blaspheme the most sacred of names?" "What names?" "Monsieur, Madame, the highest names in the kingdom." "You are very strangely mistaken, my dear comte. I never mentioned the highest names in the kingdom. I merely answered you in reference to the subject of a jealous husband, whose name you did not tell me, and who, as a matter of course, has a wife. I therefore replied to you, in order to see Madame, you must get a little more intimate with Monsieur." "Double dealer that you are," said the comte, smiling. "Was that what you said?" "Nothing else." "Very good. What then?" "Now," added Manicamp, "let the question be regarding the duchess or the duke. Very well, I shall say, let us get into the house in some way or other, for that is a tactic which cannot in any case be unfavorable to your love affair." "Ah! Manicamp, if you could but find me a pretext, a good pretext." "A pretext? I can find you 100, nay, 1,000. If Malicorne were here, he would have already hit upon 1,000 excellent pretexts." "Who is Malicorne?" replied De Guiche, half shutting his eyes like a person reflecting. "I seem to know the name." "Know him? I should think so. You owe his father 30,000 crowns." "Ah, indeed! So it is that worthy fellow from Orleans." whom you promised an appointment in Monsieur's household, not the jealous husband, but the other." "Well, then, since your friend Malicorne is such an inventive genius, let him find me a means of being adored by Monsieur, and a pretext to make my peace with him." "Very good, I'll talk to him about it. But who is that coming?" "The Vicomte de Bragelonne." "Raoul! Yes, it is he," said De Guiche, as he hastened forward to meet him. "You here, Raoul?" said De Guiche. "Yes, I was looking for you to say farewell," replied Raoul warmly, pressing the count's hand. "How do you do, Monsieur Manicamp?" "How is this, Vicomte? You are leaving us?" "Yes, a mission from the king." "Where are you going?" "To London. On leaving you, I am going to Madame. She has a letter to give me for his majesty, Charles II." "You will find her alone, for Monsieur has gone out, gone to bathe, in fact." "In that case, you, who are one of Monsieur's gentlemen in waiting, will undertake to make my excuses to him. I would have waited in order to receive any directions he might have to give me, if the desire for my immediate departure had not been intimated to me by Monsieur Fouquet on behalf of his majesty." Manicamp touched De Guiche's elbow, saying, "There's a pretext for you." "What?" "Monsieur de Bragelonne's excuses." "A weak pretext," said De Guiche. "An excellent one, if Monsieur is not angry with you, but a paltry one if he bears you ill will." "You are right, Manicamp. A pretext, however poor it may be, is all I require. And so, a pleasant journey to you, Raoul." And the two friends took a warm leave of each other. 5 minutes afterwards Raoul entered Madame's apartments, as Mademoiselle de Montalais had begged him to do. Madame was still seated at the table where she had written her letter. Before her was still burning the rose-colored taper she had used to seal it. Only in her deep reflection, for Madame seemed to be buried in thought, she had forgotten to extinguish the light. Bragelonne was a very model of elegance in every way. It was impossible to see him once without always remembering him. And not only had Madame seen him once, but it will not be forgotten he was one of the very first who had gone to meet her, and had accompanied her from Le Havre to Paris. Madame preserved, therefore, an excellent recollection of him. "Ah, Monsieur de Bragelonne," she said to him, "you are going to see my brother, who will be delighted to pay to the son a portion of the debt of gratitude he contracted with the father." "The Comte de la Fere, Madame, has been abundantly recompensed for the little service he had the happiness to render the king, by the kindness manifested towards him, and it is I who will have to convey to his majesty the assurance of the respect, devotion, and gratitude of both father and son." "Do you know my brother?" "No, your highness. I shall have the honor of seeing his majesty for the first time." "You require no recommendation to him. At all events, however, if you have any doubt about your personal merit, take me unhesitatingly for your surety." "Your royal highness overwhelms me with kindness." "No, Monsieur de Bragelonne, I well remember that we were fellow travelers once, and that I remarked your extreme prudence in the midst of the extravagant absurdities committed, on both sides, by two of the greatest simpletons in the world, Monsieur de Guiche and the Duke of Buckingham. Let us not speak of them, however, but of yourself. Are you going to England to remain there permanently? Forgive my inquiry. It is not curiosity, but a desire to be of service to you in anything I can." "No, Madame, I am going to England to fulfill a mission which his majesty has been kind enough to confide to me, nothing more." "And you propose to return to France?" "As soon as I have accomplished my mission, unless, indeed, his majesty, King Charles II should have other orders for me. He will beg you, at the very least, I am sure, to remain near him as long as possible. In that case, as I shall not know how to refuse, I will now beforehand entreat your royal highness to have the goodness to remind the King of France that one of his devoted servants is far away from him. Take care that when you are recalled, you do not consider his command an abuse of power. I do not understand you, madame. The court of France is not easily matched, I am aware, but yet we have some pretty women at the court of England also. Raoul smiled. Oh, said madame, yours is a smile which portends no good to my countrywomen. It is as though you were telling them, Monsieur de Bragelonne, I visit you, but I leave my heart on the other side of the channel. Did not your smile indicate that? Your highness is gifted with the power of reading the inmost depths of the soul, and you will understand, therefore, why, at present, any prolonged residence at the court of England would be a matter of deepest regret. And I need not inquire if so gallant a knight is recompensed in return. I have been brought up, madame, with her whom I love, and I believe our affection is mutual. In that case, do not delay your departure, Monsieur de Bragelonne, and delay not your return, for on your return we shall see two persons happy, for I hope no obstacle exists to your felicity. There is a great obstacle, madame. Indeed, what is it? The king's wishes on the subject. The king opposes your marriage. He postpones it, at least. I solicited his majesty's consent through the Comte de la Fère, and, without absolutely refusing it, he positively said it must be deferred. Is the young lady whom you love unworthy of you, then? She is worthy of a king's affection, madame. I mean, she is not, perhaps, of birth equal to your own. Her family is excellent. Is she young, beautiful? She is 17, and, in my opinion, exceedingly beautiful. Is she in the country, or at Paris? She is here at Fontainebleau, madame. At the court? Yes. Do I know her? She has the honor to form one of your highness's household. Her name? Inquired the princess, anxiously. If indeed, she added hastily, her name is not a secret. No, madame, my affection is too pure for me to make a secret of it to anyone, and with still greater reason to your royal highness, whose kindness towards me has been so extreme. It is Mademoiselle Louis de la Valliere. Madame could not restrain an exclamation, in which a feeling stronger than surprise might have been detected. Ah, she said, La Valliere, she who yesterday. She paused, and then continued. She who was taken ill, I believe? Yes, madame. It was only this morning that I heard of the accident that had befallen her. Did you see her before you came to me? I had the honor of taking leave of her. And you say, resumed madame, making a powerful effort over herself, that the king has deferred your marriage with this young girl? Yes, madame, deferred it. Did he assign any reason for this postponement? None. How long is it since the Comte de la Fère preferred his request to the king? More than a month, madame. It is very singular, said the princess, as something like a film clouded her eyes. A month, she repeated. About a month. You are right, Vicomte, said the princess, with a smile, in which de Bragelonne might have remarked a kind of restraint. My brother must not keep you too long in England. Set off at once, and in the first letter I write to England, I will claim you in the king's name. And Madame rose to place her letter in Bragelonne's hands. Raoul understood that his audience was at an end. He took the letter, bowed lowly to the princess, and left the room. "A month," murmured the princess. "Could I have been blind, then, to so great an extent, and could he have loved her for this last month?" And as Madame had nothing to do, she sat down to begin a letter to her brother, the postscript of which was a summons for Bragelonne to return. The Comte de Guiche, as we have seen, had yielded to the pressing persuasions of Manicamp, and allowed himself to be led to the stables, where they desired their horses to be got ready for them. Then, by one of the side paths, a description of which has already been given, they advanced to meet Monsieur, who, having just finished bathing, was returning towards the chateau, wearing a woman's veil to protect his face from getting burnt by the sun, which was shining very brightly. Monsieur was in one of those fits of good humor to which the admiration of his own good looks sometimes gave occasion. As he was bathing, he had been able to compare the whiteness of his body with that of the courtiers, and, thanks to the care which his royal highness took of himself, no one, not even the Chevalier de Lorraine, was able to stand the comparison. Monsieur, moreover, had been tolerably successful in swimming, and his muscles having been exercised by the healthy immersion in the cool water, he was in a light and cheerful state of mind and body. So that, at the sight of Guiche, who advanced to meet him at a hand gallop, mounted upon a magnificent white horse, the prince could not restrain an exclamation of delight. "I think matters look well," said Manicamp, who fancied he could read this friendly disposition upon his royal highness's countenance. "Good day, De Guiche, good day!" exclaimed the prince. "Long life to your royal highness!" replied De Guiche, encouraged by the tone of Philippe's voice. "Health, joy, happiness, and prosperity to your highness!" "Welcome, De Guiche. Come on my right side, but keep your horse in hand, for I wish to return at a walking pace under the cool shade of these trees." "As you please, monseigneur," said De Guiche, taking his place on the prince's right, as he had been invited to do. "Now, my dear De Guiche," said the prince, "give me a little news of that De Guiche whom I used to know formerly, and who used to pay attentions to my wife." Guiche blushed to the very whites of his eyes, while Monsieur burst out laughing, as though he had made the wittiest remark in the world. The few privileged courtiers who surrounded Monsieur thought it their duty to follow his example, although they had not heard the remark, and a noisy burst of laughter immediately followed, beginning with the first courtier, passing on through the whole company, and only terminating with the last. De Guiche, although blushing scarlet, put a good countenance on the matter. Manicamp looked at him. "Ah, monseigneur," replied De Guiche, "show a little charity towards such a miserable fellow as I am. Do not hold me up to the ridicule of the Chevalier de Lorraine." "How do you mean?" "If he hears you ridicule me, he will go beyond your highness, and will show no pity." "About your passion and the princess, do you mean? For mercy's sake, monseigneur." "Come, come, De Guiche, confess that you did get a little sweet upon Madame." "I will never confess such a thing, monseigneur." "Out of respect for me, I suppose, but I release you from respect, De Guiche. Confess, as if it were simply a question about Mademoiselle de Chalais or Mademoiselle de la Valliere." Then, breaking off, he said, beginning to laugh again, "Comte, that wasn't at all bad. A remark like a sword, which cuts two ways at once. I hit you and my brother at the same time, Chalais and La Valliere, your affianced bride and his future lady love." "Really, monseigneur," said the comte, "you are in a most brilliant humor today." "The fact is, I feel well, and then I am pleased to see you again. But you were angry with me, were you not?" "I, monseigneur? Why should I have been so?" "Because I interfered with your sarabands and your other Spanish amusements. Nay, do not deny it. On that day you left the princess's apartments with your eyes full of fury. That brought you ill luck, for you danced in the ballet yesterday in a most wretched manner. Now don't get sulky, De Guiche, for it does you no good, but makes you look like a tame bear. If the princess did not look at you attentively yesterday, I am quite sure of one thing." "What is that, monseigneur? Your highness alarms me." "She has quite forsworn you now," said the prince, with a burst of loud laughter. "Decidedly," thought Manicamp, "rank has nothing to do with it, and all men are alike." The prince continued, "At all events, you have now returned, and it is to be hoped that the chevalier will become amiable again." "How so, monseigneur? And by what miracle can I exercise such an influence over Monsieur de Lorraine?" "The matter is very simple. He is jealous of you." "Bah, it is not possible." "It is the case, though. He does me too much honor. The fact is, that when you are here, he is full of kindness and attention, but when you are gone, he makes me suffer perfect martyrdom. I am like a seesaw. Besides, you do not know the idea that has struck me. I do not even suspect it. Well, then, when you were in exile, for you really were exiled, my poor De Guiche." "I should think so, indeed. But whose fault was it?" said De Guiche, pretending to speak in an angry tone. "Not mine, certainly, my dear comte," replied his royal highness. "Upon my honor, I did not ask for the king to exile you." "No, not you, monseigneur, I am well aware. But madame? Well, as far as that goes, I do not say it was not the case. Why, what the deuce did you do or say to madame?" "Really, monseigneur!" "Women, I know, have their grudges, and my wife is not free from caprices of that nature. But if she were the cause of your being exiled, I bear you no ill will." "In that case, monseigneur," said De Guiche, "I am not altogether unhappy." Manicamp, who was following closely behind De Guiche, and who did not lose a word of what the prince was saying, bent down to his very shoulders over his horse's neck, in order to conceal the laughter he could not repress. "Besides, your exile started a project in my head." "Good." "When the chevalier, finding you were no longer here, and sure of reigning undisturbed, began to bully me, I, observing that my wife, in the most perfect contrast to him, was most kind and amiable towards me who had neglected her so much, the idea occurred to me of becoming a model husband, a rarity, a curiosity at the court, and I had an idea of getting very fond of my wife." De Guiche looked at the prince with a stupefied expression of countenance, which was not assumed. "Oh, monseigneur!" De Guiche stammered out, "surely that never seriously occurred to you." "Indeed it did. I have some property that my brother gave me on my marriage. She has some money of her own, and not a little either, for she gets money from her brother and brother-in-law of England and France at the same time. Well, we should have left the court. I should have retired to my chateau at Villers-Cotterets, situated in the middle of a forest, in which we should have led a most sentimental life in the very same spot where my grandfather, Henry IV., sojourned with La Belle Gabrielle. What do you think of that idea, De Guiche?" "Why, it is enough to make one shiver, monseigneur," replied De Guiche, who shuddered in reality. "Ah, I see you would never be able to endure being exiled a second time." "I, monseigneur? I will not carry you off with us, as I had first intended." "What, with you, monseigneur?" Yes, if the idea should occur to me again of taking a dislike to the court. Oh, do not let that make any difference, monseigneur. I would follow your highness to the end of the world. Clumsy fellow that you are, said Manicamp, grumblingly, pushing his horse towards De Guiche so as almost to unseat him, and then, as he passed close to him, as if he had lost command over the horse, he whispered, "For goodness' sake, think what you are saying." "Well, it is agreed then," said the prince. "Since you are so devoted to me, I shall take you with me." "Anywhere, monseigneur," replied De Guiche in a joyous tone, "whenever you like, and at once, too. Are you ready?" And De Guiche laughingly gave his horse the rein, and galloped forward a few yards. "One moment," said the prince, "let us go to the chateau first." "What for?" "Why, to take my wife, of course." "What for?" asked De Guiche. "Why, since I tell you that it is a project of conjugal affection, it is necessary I should take my wife with me." "In that case, monseigneur," replied the comte, "I am greatly concerned, but no De Guiche for you."
Bah!
"Yes. Why do you take Madame with you?" "Because I begin to fancy I love her," said the prince. De Guiche turned slightly pale, but endeavored to preserve his seeming cheerfulness. "If you love Madame, monseigneur," he said, "that ought to be quite enough for you, and you have no further need of your friends." "Not bad, not bad," murmured Manicamp. "There, your fear of Madame has begun again," replied the prince. "Why, monseigneur, I have experienced that to my cost. A woman who was the cause of my being exiled. What a revengeful disposition you have, De Guiche. How virulently you bear malice." "I should like the case to be your own, monseigneur." "Decidedly, then, that was the reason why you danced so badly yesterday. You wished to revenge yourself, I suppose, by trying to make Madame make a mistake in her dancing. Ah, that is very paltry, De Guiche, and I will tell Madame of it." "You may tell her whatever you please, monseigneur, for her highness cannot hate me more than she does." "Nonsense, you are exaggerating, and this is because merely of the fortnight's sojourn in the country she imposed on you." "Monseigneur, a fortnight is a fortnight, and when the time is past and getting sick and tired of everything, a fortnight is an eternity." "So that you will not forgive her?" "Never." "Come, come, De Guiche, be a better disposed fellow than that. I wish to make your peace with her. You will find, in conversing with her, that she has no malice or unkindness in her nature, and that she is very talented. Monseigneur, you will see that she can receive her friends like a princess, and laugh like a citizen's wife. You will see that, when she pleases, she can make the pleasant hours pass like minutes. Come, De Guiche, you must really make up your differences with my wife." "Upon my word," said Manicamp to himself, "the prince is a husband whose wife's name will bring him ill luck, and King Candaules of old was a tiger beside his royal highness." "At all events," added the prince, "I am sure you will make it up with my wife. I guarantee you will do so. Only, I must show you the way now. There is nothing commonplace about her. It is not every one who takes her fancy." "Monseigneur." "No resistance, De Guiche, or I shall get out of temper," replied the prince. "Well, since he will have it so," murmured Manicamp in Guiche's ear, "do as he wants you to do." "Well, monseigneur," said the count, "I obey." "And to begin," resumed the prince, "there will be cards, this evening, in Madame's apartment. You will dine with me, and I will take you there with me." "Oh, as for that, monseigneur," objected De Guiche, "you will allow me to object." "What, again? This is positive rebellion." "Madame received me too indifferently yesterday before the whole court." "Really," said the prince, laughing, Nay, so much so, indeed, that she did not even answer me when I addressed her. It may be a good thing to have no self-respect at all, but to have too little is not enough, as the saying is. Comte, after dinner, you will go to your own apartments and dress yourself, and then you will come to fetch me. I shall wait for you. Since your highness absolutely commands it. Positively. He will not lose his hold, said Manicamp. These are the things to which husbands cling most obstinately. Ah, what a pity Monsieur Moliere could not have heard this man. He would have turned him into verse if he had. The prince and his court, chatting in this manner, returned to the coolest apartments of the chateau. By the by, said De Guiche, as they were standing by the door, I had a commission for your royal highness. Execute it, then. Monsieur de Bragelonne has, by the king's order, set off for London, and he charged me with his respects for you, monseigneur. A pleasant journey to the Vicomte, whom I like very much. Go and dress yourself, De Guiche, and come back for me. If you don't come back, what will happen, monseigneur? I will have you sent to the Bastille. Well, said De Guiche, laughing, his royal highness, monseigneur, is decidedly the counterpart of her royal highness, madame. Madame gets me sent into exile because she does not care for me sufficiently, and monsieur gets me imprisoned because he cares for me too much. I thank monseigneur, and I thank madame. Come, come, said the prince, you are a delightful companion, and you know I cannot do without you. Return as soon as you can. Very well, but I am in the humor to prove myself difficult to be pleased. In my turn, monseigneur. Bah! So, I will not return to your royal highness except upon one condition. Name it. I want to oblige the friend of one of my friends. What is his name? Malicorne, an ugly name, but very well born, monseigneur. That may be. Well, well, I owe Monsieur Malicorne a place in your household, monseigneur. What kind of a place? Any kind of a place. A supervision of some sort or another, for instance. That happens very fortunately, for yesterday I dismissed my chief usher of the apartments. That will do admirably. What are his duties? Nothing, except to look about and make his report. A sort of interior police. Exactly. Ah, how excellently that will suit Malicorne, Manicamp ventured to say. You know the person we are speaking of, Monsieur Manicamp? Inquired the prince. Intimately, monseigneur. He is a friend of mine. And your opinion is? That your highness could never get a better usher of the apartments than he will make. How much does the appointment bring in? Inquired the comte of the prince. I don't know at all, only I have always been told that he could make as much as he pleased when he was thoroughly in earnest. What do you call being thoroughly in earnest, prince? It means, of course, when the functionary in question is a man who has his wits about him. In that case, I think your highness will be content, for Malicorne is as sharp as the devil himself. Good! The appointment will be an expensive one for me, in that case, replied the prince, laughing. You are making me a positive present, count. I believe so, monseigneur. Well, go and announce to your Monsieur Malicorne, monseigneur. I shall never get hold of that name. You say Manicamp very well, monseigneur. Oh, I ought to say Malicorne very well too. The alliteration will help me. Say what you like, monseigneur. I can promise you your inspector of apartments will not be annoyed. He has the very happiest disposition that can be met with. Well then, my dear De Guiche, inform him of his nomination. But stay, what is it, monseigneur? I wish to see him beforehand. If he be as ugly as his name, I retract every word I have said." "Your highness knows him, for you have already seen him at the Palais Royal. Nay, indeed, it was I who presented him to you." "Ah, I remember now. Not a bad looking fellow." "I know you must have noticed him, monseigneur." "Yes, yes, yes. You see, De Guiche, I do not wish that either my wife or myself should have ugly faces before our eyes. My wife will have all her maids of honor pretty, I all the gentlemen about me good looking. In this way, De Guiche, you see, that any children we may have will run a good chance of being pretty, if my wife and myself have handsome models before us." "Most magnificently argued, monseigneur," said Manicamp, showing his approval by look and voice at the same time. As for De Guiche, he very probably did not find the argument so convincing, for he merely signified his opinion by a gesture, which, moreover, exhibited in a marked manner some indecision of mind on the subject. Manicamp went off to inform Malicorne of the good news he had just learned. De Guiche seemed very unwilling to take his departure for the purpose of dressing himself. Monsieur, singing, laughing, and admiring himself, passed away the time until the dinner hour, in a frame of mind that justified the proverb of happy as a prince. End of chapter 55. Recording by Prachi Pense, Wilmington, Delaware.
"10 Years Later." This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 56. Story of a Dryad and a Naiad. Everyone had partaken of the banquet at the chateau, and afterwards assumed their full court dresses. The usual hour for the repast was 5 o'clock. If we say, then, that the repast occupied an hour, and the toilet 2 hours, everybody was ready at about 8 o'clock in the evening. Towards 8 o'clock, then, the guests began to arrive at Madame's, for we have already intimated that it was Madame who received that evening. And at Madame's soirees no one failed to be present, for the evenings passed in her apartments always had that perfect charm about them which the queen, that pious and excellent princess, had not been able to confer upon her reunions. For unfortunately, one of the advantages of goodness of disposition is that it is far less amusing than wit of an ill-natured character. And yet, let us hasten to add, that such a style of wit could not be assigned to Madame, for her disposition of mind, naturally of the very highest order, comprised too much true generosity, too many noble impulses and high-souled thoughts, to warrant her being termed ill-natured. But Madame was endowed with a spirit of resistance, a gift frequently fatal to its possessor, for it breaks where another disposition would have bent. The result was that blows did not become deadened upon her as upon what might be termed the cotton-wadded feelings of Maria Theresa. Her heart rebounded at each attack, and therefore, whenever she was attacked, even in a manner that almost stunned her, she returned blow for blow to anyone imprudent enough to tilt against her. Was this really maliciousness of disposition, or simply waywardness of character? We regard those rich and powerful natures as like the tree of knowledge, producing good and evil at the same time, a double branch, always blooming and fruitful, of which those who wish to eat know how to detect the good fruit, and from which the worthless and frivolous die who have eaten of it, a circumstance which is by no means to be regarded as a great misfortune. Madame, therefore, who had a well-disguised plan in her mind of constituting herself the second, if not even the principal, queen of the court, rendered her receptions delightful to all, from the conversation, the opportunities of meeting, and the perfect liberty she allowed everyone of making any remarks he pleased, on the condition, however, that the remark was amusing or sensible. And it will hardly be believed that, by that means, there was less talking among the society Madame assembled together than elsewhere. Madame hated people who talked much, and took a remarkably cruel revenge upon them, for she allowed them to talk. She disliked pretensions too, and never overlooked that defect, even in the king himself. It was more than a weakness of Monsieur, and the princess had undertaken the amazing task of curing him of it. As for the rest, poets, wits, beautiful women, all were received by her with the air of a mistress superior to her slaves. Sufficiently meditative in her liveliest humors to make even poets meditate, sufficiently pretty to dazzle by her attractions even among the prettiest, sufficiently witty for the most distinguished persons who were present to be listened to with pleasure. It will easily be believed that the reunions held in Madame's apartments most naturally had proved very attractive. All who were young flocked there, and when the king himself happens to be young, everybody at court is so too. And so the older ladies of the court, the strong-minded women of the Regency or of the last reign, pouted and sulked at their ease, but others only laughed at the fits of sulkiness in which these venerable individuals indulged, who had carried the love of authority so far as to even take command of bodies of soldiers in the wars of the Fronde, in order, as Madame asserted, not to lose their influence over men altogether. As 8 o'clock struck, her Royal Highness entered the great drawing room, accompanied by her ladies in attendance, and found several gentlemen belonging to the court already there, having been waiting for some minutes. Among those who had arrived before the hour fixed for the reception, she looked round for one who, she thought, ought to have been first in attendance, but he was not there. However, almost at the very moment she completed her investigation, Monsieur was announced. Monsieur looked splendid. All the precious stones and jewels of Cardinal Mazarin, which of course that minister could not do otherwise than leave, all the queen mother's jewels, as well as a few belonging to his wife, Monsieur wore them all, and he was as dazzling as the rising sun. Behind him followed De Guiche, with hesitating steps and an air of contrition admirably assumed. De Guiche wore a costume of French gray velvet, embroidered with silver and trimmed with blue ribbons. He wore also Mechlin lace, as rare and beautiful in its own way as the jewels of Monsieur and theirs. The plumes in his hat were red. Madame, too, wore several colors, and preferred red for embroidery, gray for dress, and blue for flowers. Monsieur de Guiche, dressed as we have described, looked so handsome that he excited everyone's observation. An interesting pallor of complexion, a languid expression of the eyes, his white hands seen through the masses of lace that covered them, the melancholy expression of his mouth, it was only necessary, indeed, to see Monsieur de Guiche, to admit that few men at the court of France could hope to equal him. The consequence was that Monsieur, who was pretentious enough to fancy he could eclipse a star even if a star had adorned itself in a similar manner to himself, was, on the contrary, completely eclipsed in all imaginations, which are silent judges certainly, but very positive and firm in their convictions. Madame looked at De Guiche lightly, but light as her look had been, it brought a delightful color to his face. In fact, Madame found De Guiche so handsome and so admirably dressed that she almost ceased regretting the royal conquest she felt was on the point of escaping her. Her heart, therefore, sent the blood to her face. Monsieur approached her. He had not noticed the princess's blush, or, if he had seen it, he was far from attributing it to its true cause. "Madame," he said, kissing his wife's hand, "there is someone present here who has fallen into disgrace, an unhappy exile whom I venture to recommend to your kindness. Do not forget, I beg, that he is one of my best friends, and that a gentle reception of him will please me greatly." "What exile? What disgraced person are you speaking of?" inquired Madame, looking all round, and not permitting her glance to rest more on the count than on the others. This was the moment to present De Guiche, and the prince drew aside, and let De Guiche pass him, who, with a tolerably well assumed awkwardness of manner, approached Madame and made his reverence to her. "What!" exclaimed Madame, as if she were greatly surprised. "Is Monsieur de Guiche the disgraced individual you speak of, the exile in question?" "Yes, certainly," returned the duke. "Indeed," said Madame, "he seems almost the only person here." "You are unjust, Madame," said the prince. "I?" "Certainly. Come, forgive the poor fellow." "Forgive him what? What have I to forgive, Monsieur de Guiche?" "Come, explain yourself, De Guiche. What do you wish to be forgiven?" inquired the prince. "Alas, her royal highness knows very well what it is," replied the latter in a hypocritical tone. "Come, come, give him your hand, Madame," said Philippe. "If it will give you any pleasure, Monsieur." And with a movement of her eyes and shoulders which it would be impossible to describe, Madame extended towards the young man her beautiful and perfumed hand, upon which he pressed his lips. It was evident that he did so for some little time, and that Madame did not withdraw her hand too quickly, for the duke added, De Guiche is not wickedly disposed, madame, so do not be afraid. He will not bite you." A pretext was given in the gallery by the duke's remark, which was not, perhaps, very laughable, for everyone to laugh excessively. The situation was odd enough, and some kindly disposed persons had observed it. Monsieur was still enjoying the effect of his remark when the king was announced. The appearance of the room at that moment was as follows. In the center, before the fireplace, which was filled with flowers, Madame was standing up, with her maids of honor formed in 2 wings on either side of her, around whom the butterflies of the court were fluttering. Several other groups were formed in the recesses of the windows, like soldiers stationed in their different towers who belonged to the same garrison. From their respective places, they could pick up the remarks which fell from the principal group. From one of these groups, the nearest to the fireplace, Malicorne, who had been at once raised to the dignity, through Manicamp and De Guiche, of the post of master of the apartments, and whose official costume had been ready for the last 2 months, was brilliant with gold lace, and shone upon Montalais, standing on Madame's extreme left, with all the fire of his eyes and splendor of his velvet. Madame was conversing with Mademoiselle de Chatillon and Mademoiselle de Crequy, who were next to her, and addressed a few words to Monsieur, who drew aside as soon as the king was announced. Mademoiselle de la Valliere, like Montalais, was on Madame's left hand, and the last but one in line, Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente being on her right. She was stationed as certain bodies of troops are, whose weakness is suspected, and who are placed between 2 experienced regiments. Guarded in this manner by the companions who had shared her adventure, La Valliere, whether from regret at Raoul's departure, or still suffering from the emotion caused by recent events, which had begun to render her name familiar on the lips of the courtiers, La Valliere, we repeat, hid her eyes, red with weeping, behind her fan, and seemed to give the greatest attention to the remarks which Montalais and D'Artagnan alternately whispered to her from time to time. As soon as the king's name was announced, a general movement took place in the apartment. Madame, in her character as hostess, rose to receive the royal visitor, but as she rose, notwithstanding her preoccupation of mind, she glanced hastily toward her right. Her glance, which the presumptuous De Guiche regarded as intended for himself, rested, as it swept over the whole circle, upon La Valliere, whose warm blush and restless emotion it instantly perceived. The king advanced to the middle of the group, which had now become a general one, by a movement which took place from the circumference to the center. Every head bowed low before his majesty, the ladies bending like frail, magnificent lilies before King Aquilo. There was nothing very severe, we will even say nothing very royal that evening about the king, except youth and good looks. He wore an air of animated joyousness and good humor, which set all imaginations at work, and, thereupon, all present promised themselves a delightful evening, for no other reason than from having remarked the desire his majesty had to amuse himself in Madame's apartments. If there was anyone in particular whose high spirits and good humor equaled the king's, it was Monsieur de Saint Aignan, who was dressed in a rose-colored costume, with face and ribbons of the same color, and, in addition, particularly rose-colored in his ideas, for that evening Monsieur de Saint Aignan was prolific in jests. The circumstance which had given a new expansion to the numerous ideas germinating in his fertile brain was, that he had just perceived that Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente was, like himself, dressed in rose color. We would not wish to say, however, that the wily courtier had not known beforehand that the beautiful Athenais was to wear that particular color, for he knew very well the art of unlocking the lips of a dressmaker or a lady's maid as to her mistress's intentions. He cast as many killing glances at Mademoiselle Athenais as he had bows on the ribbons of his stockings and doublet. In other words, he discharged a prodigious number. The king having paid Madame the customary compliments, and Madame having requested him to be seated, the circle was immediately formed. Louis inquired of Monsieur the particulars of the day's bathing, and stated, looking at the ladies present while he spoke, that certain poets were engaged in turning into verse the enchanting diversion of the baths of Vulainay, and that one of them particularly, Monsieur Loret, seemed to have been entrusted with the confidence of some water nymph, as he had in his verses recounted many circumstances that were actually true, at which remark more than one lady present felt herself bound to blush. The king at this moment saw the opportunity of looking round him at more leisure. Montalais was the only one who did not blush sufficiently to prevent her looking at the king, and she saw him fix his eyes devouringly on Mademoiselle de la Valliere. This undaunted maid of honor, Mademoiselle de Montalais, be it understood, forced the king to lower his gaze, and so saved Louise de la Valliere from a sympathetic warmth of feeling this gaze might possibly have conveyed. Louis was appropriated by Madame, who overwhelmed him with inquiries, and no one in the world knew how to ask questions better than she did. He tried, however, to render the conversation general, and with the view of effecting this, he redoubled his attention and devotion to her. Madame coveted complimentary remarks, and determined to procure them at any cost, she addressed herself to the king, saying, "Sire, your majesty, who is aware of everything which occurs in your kingdom, ought to know beforehand the verses confided to Monsieur Loret by this nymph. Will your majesty kindly communicate them to us?" "Madame," replied the king, with perfect grace of manner, "I dare not. You, personally, might be in no little degree confused at having to listen to certain details. But Saint Aignan tells the story well, and has a perfect recollection of the verses. If he does not remember them, he will invent. I can certify he is almost a poet himself." Saint Aignan, thus brought prominently forward, was compelled to introduce himself as advantageously as possible. Unfortunately, however, for Madame, he thought of his own personal affairs only. In other words, instead of paying Madame the compliments she so much desired and relished, his mind was fixed upon making as much display as possible of his own good fortune. Again glancing, therefore, for the 100th time, at the beautiful Athenais, who carried into practice her previous evening's theory of not even deigning to look at her adorer, he said, "Your majesty will perhaps pardon me for having too indifferently remembered the verses which the nymph dictated to Loret, but if the king has not retained any recollection of them, how could I possibly remember?" Madame did not receive this shortcoming of the courtier very favorably. "Ah, Madame," said Saint Aignan, "at present there is no longer a question what the water nymphs have to say, and one would almost be tempted to believe that nothing of any interest now occurs in those liquid realms. It is upon earth, Madame, important events happen. Ah, Madame, upon the earth how many tales there are full of—" "Well," said Madame, "and what is taking place upon the earth?" "That question must be asked of the Dryads," replied the comte. "The Dryads inhabit the forest, as your royal highness is aware." "I am aware, also, that they are naturally very talkative, Monsieur de Saint Aignan." "Such is the case, Madame, but when they say such delightful things, it would be ungracious to accuse them of being too talkative." "Do they talk so delightfully, then?" inquired the princess, indifferently. "Really, Monsieur de Saint Aignan, you excite my curiosity, and if I were king, I would require you immediately to tell us the delightful things that these Dryads have been saying, since you alone seem to understand their language." "I am at his majesty's orders, Madame, in that respect," replied the comte quickly. "What a fortunate fellow that Saint Aignan is to understand the language of the Dryads," said Monsieur. "I understand it perfectly, monseigneur, as I do my own language." "Tell us all about it, then," said Madame. The king felt embarrassed, for his confidant was, in all probability, about to embark in a difficult matter. He felt it would be so, from the general attention excited by Saint Aignan's preamble, and aroused, too, by Madame's peculiar manner. The most reserved of those who were present seemed ready to devour every syllable the comte was about to pronounce. They coughed, drew close together, looked curiously at some of the maids of honor, who, in order to support with greater propriety, or with more steadiness, the fixity of the inquisitorial looks bent upon them, adjusted their fans accordingly, and assumed the bearing of a duelist about to be exposed to his adversary's fire. At this epoch, the fashion of ingeniously constructed conversations and hazardously dangerous recitals so prevailed that where, in modern times, a whole company assembled in a drawing room would begin to suspect some scandal or disclosure or tragic event, and would hurry away in dismay, Madame's guests quietly settled themselves in their places, in order not to lose a word or gesture of the comedy composed by Monsieur de Saint Aignan for their benefit, and the termination of which, whatever the style and the plot might be, must, as a matter of course, be marked by the most perfect propriety. The comte was known as a man of extreme refinement and an admirable narrator. He courageously began, then, amidst a profound silence, which would have been formidable to anyone but himself. "Madame, by the king's permission, I address myself, in the first place, to your royal highness, since you admit yourself to be the person present possessing the greatest curiosity. I have the honor, therefore, to inform your royal highness that the Dryad more particularly inhabits the hollows of oaks, and as Dryads are mythological creatures of great beauty, they inhabit the most beautiful trees, in other words, the largest to be found." At this exordium, which recalled, under a transparent veil, the celebrated story of the royal oak, which had played so important a part in the last evening, so many hearts began to beat both from joy and uneasiness, that if Saint Aignan had not had a good and sonorous voice, their throbbings might have been heard above the sound of his voice. "Oh, there must surely be Dryads at Fontainebleau, then," said Madame, in a perfectly calm voice, "for I have never in all my life seen finer oaks than in the royal park." And as she spoke, she directed towards De Guiche a look of which he had no reason to complain, as he had of the one that preceded it, which, as we have already mentioned, had a preserved amount of indefiniteness most painful for so loving a heart as his. "Precisely, Madame. It is of Fontainebleau I was about to speak to your royal highness," said Saint Aignan. "For the Dryad whose story is engaging our attention lives in the park belonging to the chateau of his majesty." The affair was fairly embarked on, the action was begun, and it was no longer possible for auditory or narrator to draw back. "It will be worth listening to," said Madame, "for the story not only appears to me to have all the interest of a national incident, but still more, seems to be a circumstance of very recent occurrence." "I ought to begin at the beginning," said the comte. "In the first place, then, there lived at Fontainebleau, in a cottage of modest and unassuming appearance, two shepherds. The one was the shepherd Tyrcis, the owner of extensive domains transmitted to him from his parents by right of inheritance. Tyrcis was young and handsome, and from his many qualifications he might be pronounced to be the first and foremost among the shepherds in the whole country. One might even boldly say he was the king of shepherds." A subdued murmur of approbation encouraged the narrator, who continued, "His strength equals his courage. No one displays greater address in hunting wild beasts, nor greater wisdom in matters where judgment is required. Whenever he mounts and exercises his horse in the beautiful plains of his inheritance, or whenever he joins with the shepherds who owe him allegiance in different games of skill and strength, one might say that it is the god Mars hurling his lance on the plains of Thrace. Or better even, that it was Apollo himself, the god of day, radiant upon earth, bearing his flaming darts in his hand." Everyone understood that this allegorical portrait of the king was not the worst exordium the narrator could have chosen, and consequently it did not fail to produce its effect, either upon those who, from duty or inclination, applauded it to the very echo, or on the king himself, to whom flattery was very agreeable when delicately conveyed, and whom, indeed, it did not always displease even when a little too broad. Saint Aignan then continued, "It was not in games of glory only, ladies, that the shepherd Tyrcis had acquired that reputation by which he was regarded as the king of shepherds." "Of the shepherds of Fontainebleau," said the king, smilingly, to Madame. "Oh," said Madame, "Fontainebleau is selected arbitrarily by the poet, but I should say of the shepherds of the whole world." The king forgot his part of a passive auditor, and bowed. "It is," paused Saint Aignan, amidst a flattering murmur of applause, "it is with ladies fair especially that the qualities of this king of the shepherds are most prominently displayed. He is a shepherd with a mind as refined as his heart is pure. He can pay a compliment with the charm of manner whose fascination it is impossible to resist. And in his attachments he is so discreet that beautiful and happy conquests may regard their lot as more than enviable. Never a syllable of disclosure, nor a moment's forgetfulness. Whoever has seen and heard Tyrcis must love him. Whoever loves and is beloved by him has, indeed, found happiness." Saint Aignan here paused. He was enjoying the pleasure of all these compliments, and the portrait he had drawn, however grotesquely inflated it might be, had found favor in certain ears, in which the perfections of the shepherd did not seem to have been exaggerated. Madame begged the orator to continue. "Tyrcis," said the comte, "had a faithful companion, or rather a devoted servant, whose name was Amyntas." "Ah," said Madame, archly, "now for the portrait of Amyntas. You are such an excellent painter, Monsieur de Saint Aignan." "Madame." "Oh, comte, do not, I entreat you, sacrifice poor Amyntas. I should never forgive you." "Madame, Amyntas is of too humble a position, particularly besides Tyrcis, for his person to be honored by a parallel. There are certain friends who resemble those followers of ancient times who cause themselves to be buried alive at their master's feet. Amyntas's place, too, is at the feet of Tyrcis. He cares for no other, and if, Sometimes the illustrious hero—" "Illustrious shepherd, you mean?" said Madame, pretending to correct M. de Saint Aignan. "Your royal highness is right, I was mistaken," returned the courtier. "If, I say, the shepherd Tyrcis deigns occasionally to call Amyntas his friend, and to open his heart to him, it is an unparalleled favor which the latter regards as a most unbounded felicity." "All that you say," interrupted Madame, "establishes the extreme devotion of Amyntas to Tyrcis, but does not furnish us with a portrait of Amyntas. Come, do not flatter him if you like, but describe him to us. I will have Amyntas's portrait." Saint Aignan obeyed, after having bowed profoundly to his majesty's sister-in-law. "Amyntas," he said, "is somewhat older than Tyrcis. He is not an ill-favored shepherd; it is even said that the muses condescended to smile upon him at his birth, even as Hebe smiled upon youth. He is not ambitious of display, but he is ambitious of being loved, and he might not, perhaps, be found unworthy of it, if he were only sufficiently well known." This latter paragraph, strengthened by a killing glance, were directed straight to Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, who received them both unmoved. But the modesty and tact of the allusion had produced a good effect. Amyntas reaped the benefit of it in the applause bestowed upon him. Tyrcis's head even gave the signal for it by a consenting bow, full of good feeling. "One evening," continued Saint Aignan, "Tyrcis and Amyntas were walking together in the forest, talking of their love disappointments. Do not forget, ladies, that the story of the Dryad is now beginning; otherwise it would be easy to tell you what Tyrcis and Amyntas, the two most discreet shepherds of the whole earth, were talking about. They reached the thickest part of the forest for the purpose of being quite alone, and of confiding their troubles more freely to each other, when suddenly the sound of voices struck upon their ears." "Ah, ah," said those who surrounded the narrator, "nothing can be more interesting." At this point Madame, like a vigilant general inspecting his army, glanced at Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, who could not help wincing as they drew themselves up. "These harmonious voices," resumed Saint Aignan, "were those of certain shepherdesses who had been likewise desirous of enjoying the coolness of the shade, and who, knowing the isolated and almost unapproachable situation of the place, had betaken themselves there to interchange their ideas upon—" A burst of laughter occasioned by this remark of Saint Aignan, and an imperceptible smile of the king, as he looked at Tonnay Charente, followed this sally. "The Dryad affirms positively," continued Saint Aignan, "that the shepherdesses were 3 in number, and that all were young and beautiful." "What were their names?" said Madame quickly. "Their names?" said Saint Aignan, who hesitated from fear of committing an indiscretion. "Of course. You call your shepherds Tyrcis and Amyntas; give your shepherdesses names in a similar manner." "Oh, Madame, I am not an inventor; I simply relate what took place as the Dryad related it to me." "What did your Dryad, then, call these shepherdesses? You have a very treacherous memory, I fear. This Dryad must have fallen out with the goddess Mnemosyne." "These shepherdesses, Madame? Pray remember that it is a crime to betray a woman's name." "From which a woman absolves you, comte, on the condition that you will reveal the names of the shepherdesses." "Their names were Phyllis, Amaryllis, and Galatea."
"Exceedingly well; they have not lost by the delay," said Madame. "And now we have 3 charming names. But now for their portraits." Saint Aignan again made a slight movement. "Nay, comte, let us proceed in due order," returned Madame. "Ought we not, sire, to have the portraits of the shepherdesses?" The king, who expected this determined perseverance, and who began to feel some uneasiness, did not think it safe to provoke so dangerous an interrogator. He thought, too, that Saint Aignan, in drawing the portraits, would find a means of insinuating some flattering allusions which would be agreeable to the ears of one his majesty was interested in pleasing. It was with this hope and with this fear that Louis authorized Saint Aignan to sketch the portraits of the shepherdesses Phyllis, Amaryllis, and Galatea. "Very well, then, be it so," said Saint Aignan, like a man who has made up his mind, and he began. Chapter 56. 10 years later.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 57. Conclusion of the story of a Naiad and of a Dryad.
"Phyllis," said Saint Aignan, with a glance of defiance at Montalais, such as a fencing master would give who invites an antagonist worthy of him to place himself on guard. "Phyllis is neither fair nor dark, neither tall nor short, neither too grave nor too gay. Though but a shepherdess, she is as witty as a princess, and as coquettish as the most finished flirt that ever lived. Nothing can equal her excellent vision. Her heart yearns for everything her gaze embraces. She is like a bird which, always warbling, at one moment skims the ground, at the next rises fluttering in pursuit of a butterfly, then rests itself upon the topmost branch of a tree, where it defies the bird catchers either to come and seize it, or to entrap it in their nets." The portrait bore such a strong resemblance to Montalais that all eyes were directed towards her. She, however, with her head raised, and with a steady, unmoved look, listened to Saint Aignan as if he were speaking of an utter stranger. "Is that all, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?" inquired the princess. "Oh, your royal highness, the portrait is but a mere sketch, and many more additions could be made, but I fear to weary your patience or offend the modesty of the shepherdess, and I shall therefore pass on to her companion, Amaryllis."
"Very well," said Madame. "Pass on to Amaryllis, Monsieur de Saint Aignan. We are all attention."
"Amaryllis is the eldest of the three, and yet," Saint Aignan hastened to add, "this advanced age does not reach 20 years."
Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, who had knitted her brows at the commencement of the description, unbent them with a smile.
"She is tall, with an astonishing abundance of beautiful hair, which she fastens in the manner of the Grecian statues. Her walk is full of majesty, her attitude haughty. She has the air, therefore, rather of a goddess than a mere mortal, and, among the goddesses, she most resembles Diana the huntress, with this sole difference, however, that the cruel shepherdess, having stolen the quiver of a young love while poor Cupid was sleeping in a thicket of roses, instead of directing her arrows against the inhabitants of the forest, discharges them pitilessly against all the poor shepherds who pass within reach of her bow and of her eyes."
"Oh, what a wicked shepherdess!" said Madame. "She may some day wound herself with one of those arrows she discharges, as you say, so mercilessly on all sides."
"It is the hope of the shepherds, one and all," said Saint Aignan.
"And that of the shepherd Amyntas in particular, I suppose?" said Madame.
"The shepherd Amyntas is so timid," said Saint Aignan, with the most modest air he could assume, "that if he cherishes such a hope as that, no one has ever known anything about it, for he conceals it in the very depths of his heart."
A flattering murmur of applause greeted this profession of faith on behalf of the shepherd. "And Galatea?" inquired Madame. "I am impatient to see a hand so skillful as yours continue the portrait where Virgil left it, and finish it before our eyes."
"Madame," said Saint Aignan, "I am indeed a poor dumb post beside the mighty Virgil. Still, encouraged by your desire, I will do my best."
Saint Aignan extended his foot and hand, and thus began.
"White as milk, she casts upon the breeze the perfume of her fair hair tinged with golden hues, as are the ears of corn. One is tempted to inquire if she is not the beautiful Europa, who inspired Jupiter with a tender passion as she played with her companions in the flower-spangled meadows. From her exquisite eyes, blue as azure heaven on the clearest summer day, emanates a tender light, which reverie nurtures and love dispenses. When she frowns or bends her looks towards the ground, the sun is veiled in token of mourning. When she smiles, on the contrary, nature resumes her jollity, and the birds, for a brief moment silenced, recommence their songs amid the leafy covert of the trees. Galatea, said Saint Aignan in conclusion, is worthy of the admiration of the whole world, and if she should ever bestow her heart upon another, happy will that man be to whom she consecrates her first affections."
Madame, who had attentively listened to the portrait Saint Aignan had drawn, as, indeed, had all the others, contented herself with accentuating her approbation of the most poetic passage by occasional inclinations of her head; but it was impossible to say if these marks of assent were accorded to the ability of the narrator or to the resemblance of the portrait. The consequence, therefore, was, that as Madame did not openly exhibit any approbation, no one felt authorized to applaud, not even Monsieur, who secretly thought that Saint Aignan dwelt too much upon the portraits of the shepherdesses, and had somewhat slightingly passed over the portraits of the shepherds. The whole assembly seemed suddenly chilled. Saint Aignan, who had exhausted his rhetorical skill and his palette of artistic tints in sketching the portrait of Galatea, and who, after the favor with which his other descriptions had been received, already imagined he could hear the loudest applause allotted to this one, was himself more disappointed than the king and the rest of the company. A moment's silence followed, which was at last broken by Madame. "Well, sir," she inquired, "what is your majesty's opinion of these three portraits?" The king, who wished to relieve Saint Aignan's embarrassment without compromising himself, replied, "Why, Amaryllis, in my opinion, is beautiful." "For my part," said Monsieur, "I prefer Phyllis. She is a capital girl, or rather a good sort of fellow of a nymph." A general laugh followed, and this time the looks were so direct that Montalais felt herself blushing almost scarlet. "Well," resumed Madame, "what were those shepherdesses saying to each other?" Saint Aignan, however, whose vanity had been wounded, did not feel himself in a position to sustain an attack of new and refreshed troops, and merely said, "Madame, the shepherdesses were confiding to one another their little preferences." "Nay, nay, Monsieur de Saint Aignan, you are a perfect stream of pastoral poesy," said Madame with an irresistible smile, which somewhat comforted the narrator. "They confess that love is a mighty peril, but that the absence of love is the heart's sentence of death." "What was the conclusion they came to?" inquired Madame. "They came to the conclusion that love was necessary." "Very good. Did they lay down any conditions?" "That of choice simply," said Saint Aignan. "I ought even to add, remember that it is the Dryad who is speaking, that one of the shepherdesses, Amaryllis, I believe, was completely opposed to the necessity of loving, and yet she did not positively deny that she had allowed the image of a certain shepherd to take refuge in her heart." "Was it Amyntas or Tyrcis?" "Amyntas, Madame," said Saint Aignan modestly. "But Galatea, the gentle and soft-eyed Galatea, immediately replied that neither Amyntas, nor Alphesiboeus, nor Tityrus, nor indeed any of the handsomest shepherds of the country, were to be compared to Tyrcis; that Tyrcis was as superior to all other men as the oak to all other trees, as the lily in its majesty to all other flowers. She drew even such a portrait of Tyrcis that Tyrcis himself, who was listening, must have felt truly flattered at it, notwithstanding his rank as a shepherd. Thus, Tyrcis and Amyntas had been distinguished by Amaryllis and Galatea, and thus had the secrets of two hearts revealed beneath the shades of the evening and amid the recesses of the woods. Such, Madame, is what the Dryad related to me, she who knows all that takes place in the hollows of oaks and grassy dells, she who knows the loves of the birds and all they wish to convey by their songs, she who understands, in fact, the language of the wind among the branches, the humming of the insect with its gold and emerald wings, and the corolla of the wild flowers. It was she who related the particulars to me, and I have repeated them." "And now you have finished, Monsieur de Saint Aignan, have you not?" said Madame, with a smile that made the king tremble. "Quite finished," replied Saint Aignan, "and but too happy if I have been able to amuse your royal highness for a few moments." "Moments which have been too brief," replied the princess, "for they have related most admirably all you know. But, my dear Monsieur de Saint Aignan, you have been unfortunate enough to obtain your information from one Dryad only, I believe?"
Yes, madame, only from one, I confess.
The fact was that you passed by a little naiad who pretended to know nothing at all, and yet
Knew a great deal more than your dryad, my dear comte.
a naiad, repeated several voices, who began to suspect that the story had a continuation. Of course, close beside the oak you are speaking of, which, if I am not mistaken, is called the Royal Oak, is it not so, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?
Saint Aignan and the king exchanged glances. Yes, madame, the former replied.
Well, close beside the oak there is a pretty little spring, which runs murmuringly over the pebbles between banks of forget-me-nots and daffodils. I believe you are correct, said the king with some uneasiness, and listening with some anxiety to his sister-in-law's narrative.
Oh, there is one, I can assure you, said madame,
and the proof of it is that the naiad who resides in that little stream stopped me as I was about to come.
Ah, said Saint Aignan.
Yes, indeed, continued the princess, and she did so in order to communicate to me many particulars Monsieur de Saint Aignan has omitted in his recital.
Pray relate them yourself, then, said Monsieur. You can relate stories in such a charming manner.
The princess bowed at the conjugal compliment paid to her. I do not possess the poetical powers of the comte, nor his ability to bring to light the smallest details.
You will not be listened to with less interest on that account, said the king, who already perceived that something hostile was intended in his sister-in-law's story.
I speak, too, continued Madame, in the name of that poor little naiad, who is indeed the most charming creature I ever met. Moreover, she laughed so heartily while she was telling me her story that, in pursuance of that medical axiom that laughter is the finest physic in the world, I ask permission to laugh a little myself when I recollect her words.
The king and Saint Aignan, who noticed spreading over many of the faces present a distant and prophetic ripple of the laughter Madame announced, finished by looking at each other, as if asking themselves whether there was not some little conspiracy concealed beneath these words. But Madame was determined to turn the knife in the wound over and over again. She therefore resumed with the air of the most perfect candor, in other words, the most dangerous of all her airs.
Well, then, I passed that way, she said, and I found beneath my steps many fresh flowers newly blown. No doubt Phyllis, Amaryllis, Galatea, and all your shepherdesses had passed the same way before me.
The king bit his lips, for the recital was becoming more and more threatening.
My little naiad, continued Madame, was cooing over her quaint little song in the bed of rivulets, as I perceived that she accosted me by touching the hem of my dress. I could not think of receiving her advances ungraciously, and more particularly so, since, after all, a divinity, even though she be of a second grade, is always of a greater importance than a mortal, though a princess. I thereupon accosted the naiad, and bursting into laughter, this is what she said to me. Fancy, princess. You understand, sire, it is the naiad who is speaking?
The king bowed assentingly, and Madame continued.
Fancy, princess, the banks of my little stream have just witnessed a most amusing scene. Two shepherds, full of curiosity, even indiscreetly so, have allowed themselves to be mystified in a most amusing manner by three nymphs, or three shepherdesses. I beg your pardon, but I do not now remember if it was nymphs or shepherdesses she said, but it does not much matter, so we will continue.
The king, at this opening, colored visibly, and Saint Aignan, completely losing countenance, began to open his eyes in the greatest possible anxiety.
The two shepherds, pursued my nymph, still laughing, followed in the wake of the three young ladies. No, I mean of the three nymphs, forgive me, I ought to say, of the three shepherdesses. It is not always wise to do that, for it may be awkward for those who are followed. I appeal to all the ladies present, and not one of them, I am sure, will contradict me.
The king, who was much disturbed by what he suspected was about to follow, signified his assent by a gesture.
But, continued the naiad, the shepherdesses had noticed Tyrcis and Amyntas gliding into the wood, and by the light of the moon they had recognized them through the groves of the trees. Ha! You laugh, interrupted Madame. Wait, we are not yet at the end.
The king turned pale. Saint Aignan wiped his forehead, now dewed with perspiration. Among the groups of ladies present could be heard smothered laughter and stealthy whispers.
The shepherdesses, I was saying, noticing how indiscreet the two shepherds were, proceeded to sit down at the foot of the royal oak,
and when they perceived that their over-curious listeners were sufficiently near, so that not a syllable of what they might say could be lost, they addressed towards them very innocently, in the most artless manner in the world indeed, a passionate declaration which, from the vanity natural to all men, and even the most sentimental of shepherds, seemed to the two listeners as sweet as honey. The king, at these words, which the assembly was unable to hear without laughing, could not restrain a flash of anger darting from his eyes. As for Saint Aignan, he let his head fall upon his breast and concealed, under a silly laugh, the extreme annoyance he felt. "Oh," said the king, drawing himself up to his full height, "upon my word, this is a most amusing jest, certainly, but really and truly, are you sure you quite understood the language of the Naiads?" "The comte, sire, pretends to have perfectly understood that of the Dryads," retorted Madame icily. "No doubt," said the king, "but you know the comte has a weakness to aspire to become a member of the Academy, so that, with this object in view, he has learnt all sorts of things of which very happily you are ignorant, and it might possibly happen that the language of the nymph of the waters might be among the number of things you have not studied." "Of course, sire," replied Madame. "For the facts of that nature one does not altogether rely upon one's self alone. A woman's ear is not infallible, so says Saint Augustine, and I, therefore, wishing to satisfy myself by another opinion besides my own, and as my Naiad, who, in her character of a goddess, is polyglot, is that not the expression, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?" "I believe so," said the latter, quite out of countenance. "Well," continued the princess, "as my Naiad, who, in her character of a goddess, had at first spoken to me in English, I feared, as you suggest, that I might have misunderstood her, and I requested Mesdemoiselles de Montalais, de Tournay-Charente, and de la Valliere to come to me, begging my Naiad to repeat to me in the French language the recital she had already communicated to me in English." "And did she do so?" inquired the king. "Oh, she is the most polite divinity it is possible to imagine. Yes, sire, she did so that no doubt whatever remains on the subject. Is it not so, young ladies?" said the princess, turning toward the left of her army. "Did not the Naiad say precisely what I have related? And have I, in any one particular, exceeded the truth, Phyllis? I beg your pardon, I mean Mademoiselle de Montalais." "Precisely as you have stated, madame," articulated Mademoiselle de Montalais very distinctly. "Is it true, Mademoiselle de Tournay-Charente?" "The perfect truth," replied Athenais, in a voice quite as firm, but not yet so distinct. "And you, La Valliere?" asked Madame. The poor girl felt the king's ardent look fixed upon her. She dared not deny, she dared not tell a falsehood; she merely bowed her head, and everybody took it for a token of assent. Her head, however, was not raised again, chilled as she was by a coldness more bitter than that of death. This triple testimony overwhelmed the king. As for Saint Aignan, he did not even attempt to dissemble his despair, and, hardly knowing what he said, he stammered out, "An excellent jest, admirably played." "A just punishment for curiosity," said the king in a hoarse voice. "Oh, who would think, after the chastisement that Tyrcis and Amyntas had suffered, of endeavoring to surprise what is passing in the heart of shepherdesses? Assuredly I shall not, for one. And you, gentlemen?" "Nor I, nor I," repeated in chorus the group of courtiers. Madame was filled with triumph at the king's annoyance, and was full of delight, thinking that her story had been, or was to be, the termination of the whole affair. As for Monsieur, who had laughed at the two stories without comprehending anything about them, he turned towards De Guiche and said to him, "Well, comte, you say nothing. Can you not find something to say? Do you pity Monsieur Tyrcis and Monsieur Amyntas, for instance?" "I pity them with all my soul," replied De Guiche, "for, in very truth, love is so sweet a fancy that to lose it, fancy though it may be, is to lose more than life itself. If, therefore, these two shepherds thought themselves beloved, if they were happy in that idea, and if, instead of that happiness, they meet not only that empty void which resembles death, but jeers and jests at love itself, which is worse than 1,000 deaths, in that case I say that Tyrcis and Amyntas are the two most unhappy men I know." "And you are right, too, Monsieur de Guiche," said the king, "for in fact the injury in question is a very hard return for a little harmless curiosity." "That is to say, then, that the story of my Naiad has displeased the king?" asked Madame, innocently. "Nay, Madame, undeceive yourself," said Louis, taking the princess by the hand. Your Naiad, on the contrary, has pleased me, and the more so because she was so truthful, and because her tale, I ought to add, is confirmed by the testimony of unimpeachable witnesses." These words fell upon La Valliere, accompanied by a look that no one, from Socrates to Montaigne, could have exactly defined. The look and the king's remark succeeded in overpowering the unhappy girl, who, with her head upon Montalais's shoulder, seemed to have fainted away. The king rose without remarking this circumstance, of which no one, moreover, took any notice, and contrary to his usual custom, for generally he remained late in Madame's apartments, he took his leave, and retired to his own side of the palace. Saint Aignan followed him, leaving the rooms in as much despair as he had entered them with delight. Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, less sensitive than La Valliere, was not much frightened, and did not faint. However, it may be that the last look of Saint Aignan had hardly been so majestic as the king's. End of chapter 57.
Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 58. Royal Psychology. The king returned to his apartments with hurried steps. The reason he walked as fast as he did was probably to avoid tottering in his gait. He seemed to leave behind him as he went along a trace of a mysterious sorrow. That gaiety of manner which everyone had remarked in him on his arrival, and which they had been delighted to perceive, had not, perhaps, been understood in its true sense, but his stormy departure, his disordered countenance, all knew, or at least thought they could tell the reason of. Madame's levity of manner, her somewhat bitter jests, bitter for persons of a sensitive disposition, and particularly for one of the king's character, the great resemblance which naturally existed between the king and an ordinary mortal, were among the reasons assigned for the precipitate and unexpected departure of his majesty. Madame, keen-sighted enough in other respects, did not, however, at first see anything extraordinary in it. It was quite sufficient for her to have inflicted some slight wound upon the vanity or self-esteem of one who, so soon forgetting the engagements he had contracted, seemed to have undertaken to disdain, without cause, the noblest and highest prize in France. It was not an unimportant matter for Madame, in the present position of affairs, to let the king perceive the difference which existed between the bestowal of his affections on one in a high station and the running after each passing fancy, like a youth fresh from the provinces. With regard to those higher placed affections, recognizing their dignity and their illimitable influence, acknowledging in them a certain etiquette and display, a monarch not only did not act in a manner derogatory to his high position, but found even repose, security, mystery, and general respect therein. On the contrary, in the debasement of a common or humble attachment, he would encounter, even among his meanest subjects, carping and sarcastic remarks. He would forfeit his character of infallibility and inviolability. Having descended to the region of petty human miseries, he would be subjected to paltry contentions. In one word, to convert the royal divinity into a mere mortal by striking at his heart, or rather even at his face, like the meanest of his subjects, was to inflict a terrible blow upon the pride of that generous nature. Louis was more easily captivated by vanity than by affection. Madame had wisely calculated her vengeance, and it has been seen, also, in what manner she carried it out. Let it not be supposed, however, that Madame possessed such terrible passions as the heroines of the Middle Ages, or that she regarded things from a pessimistic point of view. On the contrary, Madame, young, amiable, of cultivated intellect, coquettish, loving in her nature, but rather from fancy, or imagination, or ambition than from her heart. Madame, we say, on the contrary, inaugurated that epoch of light and fleeting amusements which distinguished the 120 years that intervened between the middle of the 17th century and the last quarter of the 18th. Madame saw, therefore, or rather fancied she saw, things under their true aspect. She knew that the king, her august brother-in-law, had been the first to ridicule the humble La Valliere, and that, in accordance with his usual custom,
it was hardly probable that he would ever love the person who had excited his laughter, even had it been only for a moment. Moreover, was not her vanity ever present, that evil influence which plays so important a part in that comedy of dramatic incidents called the life of a woman? Did not her vanity tell her, aloud, in a subdued voice, in a whisper, in every variety of tone, that she could not, in reality, she, a princess, young, beautiful, and rich, be compared to the poor La Valliere, as youthful as herself, in truth, but far less pretty, certainly, and utterly without money, protectors, or position? And surprise need not be excited with respect to Madame, for it is known that the greatest characters are those who flatter themselves the most in the comparisons they draw between themselves and others, between others and themselves. It may perhaps be asked what was Madame's motive for an attack so skillfully conceived and executed. Why was there such a display of forces, if it was not seriously her intention to dislodge the king from a heart that had never been occupied before, in which he seemed disposed to take refuge? Was there any necessity, then, for Madame to attach so great an importance to La Valliere if she did not fear her? Yet Madame did not fear La Valliere in that direction in which a historian, who knows everything, sees into the future, or rather the past. Madame was neither a prophetess nor a sibyl, nor could she, any more than another, read what was written in that terrible and fatal book of the future, which records in its most secret pages the most serious events. No, Madame desired simply to punish the king for having availed himself of secret means altogether feminine in their nature. She wished to prove to him that if he made use of offensive weapons of that nature, she, a woman of ready wit and high descent, would assuredly discover in the arsenal of her imagination defensive weapons proof even against the thrusts of a monarch. Moreover, she wished him to learn that, in a war of that description, kings are held of no account, or, at all events, that kings who fight on their own behalf, like ordinary individuals, may witness the fall of their crown in the first encounter, and that, in fact, if he had expected to be adored by all the ladies of the court from the very first, from a confidential reliance on his mere appearance, it was a pretension which was most preposterous and insulting, even for certain persons who filled a higher position than others, and that a lesson taught in season to this royal personage, who assumed too high and haughty a carriage, would be rendering him a great service. Such, indeed, were Madame's reflections with respect to the king. The sequel itself was not thought of. And in this manner it will be seen that she had exercised all her influence over the minds of her maids of honor, and, with all its accompanying details, had arranged the comedy which had just been acted. The king was completely bewildered by it. For the first time since he had escaped from the trammels of M. de Mazarin, he found himself treated as a man. Similar severity from any of his subjects would have been at once resisted by him. Strength comes with battle. But to match one's self with women, to be attacked by them, or to have been imposed upon by mere girls from the country, who have come from Blois expressly for that purpose, it was the depth of dishonor for a young sovereign, full of the pride his personal advantages and royal power inspired him with. There was nothing he could do, neither reproaches nor exile, nor could he even show the annoyance he felt. To manifest vexation would have been to admit that he had been touched, like Hamlet, by a sword from which the button had been removed, the sword of ridicule. To show animosity against women, humiliation, especially when the women in question have laughter on their side as a means of vengeance. If, instead of leaving all the responsibility of the affair to these women, one of the courtiers had had anything to do with the intrigue, how delightedly would Louis have turned the Bastille to personal account! But there, again, the king's anger paused, checked by reason. To be the master of armies, of prisons, of an almost divine authority, and to exert such majesty and might in the service of a petty grudge, would be unworthy not only of a monarch, but even of a man. It was necessary, therefore, simply to swallow the affront in silence, and to wear his usual gentleness and graciousness of expression. It was essential to treat Madame as a friend. As a friend? Well, and why not? Either Madame had been the instigator of the affair, or the affair itself had found her passive. If she had been the instigator of it, it certainly was a bold measure on her part, but, at all events, it was but natural in her. Who was it that had sought her in the earliest moments of her married life to whisper words of love in her ear? Who was it that had dared to calculate the possibility of committing a crime against the marriage vow, a crime, too, still more deplorable on account of the relationship between them? Who was it that, shielded behind his royal authority, had said to this young creature, "Be not afraid, love but the King of France, who is above all, and a movement of whose sceptred hand will protect you against all attacks, even from your own remorse. And she had listened to and obeyed the royal voice, had been influenced by his ensnaring tones, and, when morally speaking, she had sacrificed her honor in listening to him, she saw herself repaid for her sacrifice by an infidelity the more humiliating since it was occasioned by a woman far beneath her in the world. Had Madame, therefore, been the instigator of the revenge, she would have been right. If, on the contrary, she had remained passive in the whole affair, what grounds had the king to be angry with her on that account? Was it for her to restrain, or rather, could she restrain the chattering of a few country girls? And was it for her, by an excess of zeal that might have been misinterpreted, to check, at the risk of increasing it, the impertinence of their conduct? All these various reasonings were like so many actual stings to the king's pride, but when he had carefully, in his own mind, gone over all the various causes of the complaint, Louis was surprised, upon due reflection, in other words, after the wound had been dressed, to find that there were other causes of suffering, secret, unendurable, and unrevealed. There was one circumstance he dared not confess, even to himself, namely, that the acute pain from which he was suffering had its seat in his heart. The fact is, he had permitted his heart to be gratified by La Valliere's innocent confusion. He had dreamed of a pure affection, of an affection for Louis the man, and not the sovereign, of an affection free from all self-interest, and his heart, simpler and more youthful than he had imagined it to be, had to meet that other heart that had revealed itself to him by its aspirations. The commonest thing in the complicated history of love is the double inoculation of love to which any two hearts are subjected. The one loves nearly always before the other, in the same way that the latter finishes nearly always by loving after the other. In this way, the electric current is established, in proportion to the intensity of the passion which is first kindled. The more Mademoiselle de la Valliere showed her affection, the more the king's affection had increased. And it was precisely that which had annoyed his majesty. For it was now fairly demonstrated to him that no sympathetic current had been the means of hurrying his heart away in its course, because there had been no confession of love in the case, because the confession was, in fact, an insult towards the man and towards the sovereign, and finally because, and the word, too, burnt like a hot iron, because, in fact, it was nothing but a mystification after all. This girl, therefore, who, in strictness, could not lay any claim to beauty, or birth, or great intelligence, who had been selected by Madame herself on account of her unpretending disposition, had not only aroused the king's regard, but had, moreover, treated him with disdain, he, the king, a man who, like an Eastern potentate, had but to bestow a glance, to indicate with his finger, to throw his handkerchief. Since the previous evening, his imagination had been occupied by clothing her image with charms to which she could not lay claim. In very truth, he whom such vast interests summoned, and whom so many women smiled upon invitingly, had, since the previous evening, consecrated every moment of his time, every throb of his heart, to this sole dream. It was, indeed, either too much, or not sufficient. The indignation of the king, making him forget everything, and, among others, that Saint Aignan was present, was poured out in the most violent imprecations. True it is that Saint Aignan had taken refuge in a corner of the room, and from his corner regarded the tempest passing over. His own personal disappointment seemed contemptible in comparison with the anger of the king. He compared with his own petty vanity the prodigious pride of offended majesty, and, being well read in the hearts of kings in general, and in those of powerful kings in particular, he began to ask himself if this weight of anger, as yet held in suspense, would not soon terminate by falling upon his own head, for the very reason that others were guilty and he innocent. In point of fact, the king all at once did arrest his hurried pace, and, fixing a look full of anger upon Saint Aignan, suddenly cried out, "And you, Saint Aignan?" Saint Aignan made a sign which was intended to signify, "Well, sire?" "Yes, you have been as silly as myself, I think." "Sire," stammered out Saint Aignan, "you have permitted us to be deceived by this shameless trick." "Sire," said Saint Aignan, whose agitation was such as to make him tremble in every limb, "let me entreat your majesty not to exasperate yourself. Women, you know, are characters full of imperfections, created for the misfortune of mankind. To expect anything good from them is to require them to perform impossibilities." The king, who had the greatest consideration for himself,
and who had begun to acquire over his emotions that command which he preserved over them all his life, perceived that he was doing an outrage to his own dignity in displaying such animosity about so trifling an object. "No," he said hastily, "you are mistaken, Saint Aignan. I am not angry. I can only wonder that we should have been turned into ridicule so cleverly and with such audacity by these young girls. I am particularly surprised that, although we might have informed ourselves accurately on the subject, we were silly enough to leave the matter for our own hearts to decide." "The heart, sire, is an organ which requires positively to be reduced to its material functions, but which, for the sake of humanity's peace of mind, should be deprived of all its metaphysical inclinations. For my own part, I confess, when I saw that your majesty's heart was so taken up by this little—" "My heart taken up! My mind might, perhaps, have been so, but as for my heart, it was—" Louis again perceived that, in order to fill one gulf, he was about to dig another. "Besides," he added, "I have no fault to find with the girl. I am aware that she is in love with someone else." "The Vicomte de Bragelonne. I informed your majesty of the circumstance." "You did so, but you were not the first who told me. The Comte de la Fere had solicited from me Mademoiselle de la Valliere's hand for his son, and on his returning from England the marriage shall be celebrated, since they love each other." "I recognize your majesty's great generosity of disposition in that act." "So, Saint Aignan, we will cease to occupy ourselves with these matters any longer," said Louis. "Yes, we will digest the affront, sire," replied the courtier, with resignation. "Besides, it will be an easy matter to do so," said the king, checking a sigh. "And, by way of a beginning, I will set about the composition of an epigram upon all three of them. I will call it the Naiad and the Dryad, which will please madame." "Do so, Saint Aignan, do so," said the king indifferently. "You shall read me your verses, they will amuse me. Ah, it does not signify, Saint Aignan," added the king, like a man breathing with difficulty. "The blow requires more than human strength to support it in a dignified manner." As the king thus spoke, assuming an air of the most angelic patience, one of the servants in attendance knocked gently at the door. Saint Aignan drew aside, out of respect. "Come in," said the king. The servant partially opened the door. "What is it?" inquired Louis. The servant held out a letter of a triangular shape. "For your majesty," he said. "From whom?" "I do not know. One of the officers on duty gave it to me." The valet, in obedience to a gesture of the king, handed him the letter. The king advanced towards the candles, opened the note, read the signature, and uttered a loud cry. Saint Aignan was sufficiently respectful not to look on, but, without looking on, he saw and heard all, and ran towards the king, who, with a gesture, dismissed the servant. "Oh, heavens!" said the king, as he read the note. "Is your majesty unwell?" inquired Saint Aignan, stretching forth his arms. "No, no, Saint Aignan, read!" and he handed him the note. Saint Aignan's eyes fell upon the signature. "La Valliere!" he exclaimed. "Oh, sire!" "Read, read!" And Saint Aignan read: "Forgive my importunity, sire, and forgive also the absence of the formalities which may be wanting in this letter. A note seems to be more speedy and more urgent than a dispatch. I venture, therefore, to address this note to your majesty. I have retired to my own room, overcome with grief and fatigue, sire, and I implore your majesty to grant me the favor of an audience, which will enable me to confess the truth to my sovereign. Louise de la Valliere." "Well?" asked the king, taking the letter from Saint Aignan's hands, who was completely bewildered by what he had just read. "Well!" repeated Saint Aignan. "What do you think of it?" "I hardly know." "Still, what is your opinion?" "Sire, the young lady must have heard the muttering of the thunder and has got frightened." "Frightened at what?" asked Louis, with dignity. "Why, your majesty has 1,000 reasons to be angry with the author or authors of so hazardous a joke, and if your majesty's memory were to be awakened in a disagreeable sense, it would be a perpetual menace hanging over the head of this imprudent girl." "Saint Aignan, I do not think as you do." "Your majesty doubtless sees more clearly than myself." "Well, I see affliction and restraint in these lines, more particularly since I recall some of the details of the scene which took place this evening in Madame's apartments." The king suddenly stopped, leaving his meaning unexpressed.
In fact, resumed Saint Aignan, your majesty will grant an audience. Nothing is clearer than that. I will do better, Saint Aignan. What is that, sire? Put on your cloak. But, sire, you know the suite of rooms where Madame's maids of honor are lodged? Certainly. You know some means of obtaining an entrance there? As far as that is concerned, I do not. At all events, you must be acquainted with someone there. Really, your majesty is the source of every good idea. You do know someone, then. Who is it? I know a certain gentleman who is on very good terms with a certain young lady there. One of the maids of honor? Yes, sire. With Mademoiselle de Tonnay-Charente, I suppose, said the king, laughing. Fortunately, no, sire, with Montalais. What is his name? Malicorne. And you can depend on him? I believe so, sire. He ought to have a key of some sort in his possession, and if he should happen to have one, as I have done him a service, why, he will let us have it. Nothing could be better. Let us set off immediately. The king threw his cloak over Saint Aignan's shoulders, asked him for his, and both went out into the vestibule. End of chapter 58. Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 59. Something that neither Naiad nor Dryad foresaw. Saint Aignan stopped at the foot of the staircase leading to the entrance hall, where the maids of honor were lodged, and to the first floor, where Madame's apartments were situated. Then, by means of one of the servants who was passing, he sent to apprise Malicorne, who was still with Monsieur. After having waited 10 minutes, Malicorne arrived, full of self-importance. The king drew back towards the darkest part of the vestibule. Saint Aignan, on the contrary, advanced to meet him, but at the first words indicating his wish, Malicorne drew back abruptly. Oh, he said, you want me to introduce you into the rooms of the maids of honor? Yes. You know very well I cannot do anything of the kind without being made acquainted with your object. Unfortunately, my dear Monsieur Malicorne, it is quite impossible for me to give you any explanation. You must therefore confide in me as in a friend, who got you out of a great difficulty yesterday, and who now begs you to draw him out of one today. Yet I told you, monsieur, what my object was, which was not to sleep out in the open air, and any man might express the same wish, whilst you, however, admit nothing. Believe me, my dear Monsieur Malicorne, Saint Aignan persisted, that if I were permitted to explain myself, I would do so. In that case, my dear monsieur, it is impossible for me to allow you to enter Mademoiselle de Montalais's apartment. Why so? You know why better than anyone else. Since you caught me on the wall paying my addresses to Mademoiselle de Montalais, it would, therefore, be an excess of kindness on my part, you will admit, since I am paying my attentions to her, to open the door of her room to you. But who told you it was on her account I asked you for the key? For whom, then? She does not lodge there alone, I suppose. No, certainly, for Mademoiselle de la Valliere shares her rooms with her, but really, you have nothing more to do with Mademoiselle de la Valliere than with Mademoiselle de Montalais, and there are only two men to whom I would give this key, to Monsieur de Bragelonne, if he begged me to give it to him, and to the king, if he commanded me. In that case, give me the key, monsieur, I order you to do so, said the king, advancing from the obscurity, and partially opening his cloak. Mademoiselle de Montalais will step down to talk with you, while we go upstairs to Mademoiselle de la Valliere, for, in fact, it is she only whom we desire to see. The king! Exclaimed Malicorne, bowing to the very ground. Yes, the king, said Louis, smiling, the king, who is as pleased with your resistance as with your capitulation. Rise, monsieur, and render us the service we request of you. I obey your majesty, said Malicorne, leading the way up the staircase. "Get Mademoiselle de Montalais to come down," said the king, "and do not breathe a word to her of my visit." Malicorne bowed in token of obedience, and proceeded up the staircase. But the king, after a hasty reflection, followed him, and that, too, with such rapidity that, although Malicorne was already more than halfway up the staircase, the king reached the room at the same moment. He then observed, by the door which remained half opened behind Malicorne, La Valliere, sitting in an armchair, with her head thrown back, and in the opposite corner Montalais, who, in her dressing gown, was standing before a looking glass, engaged in arranging her hair, and parleying the while with Malicorne. The king hurriedly opened the door and entered the room. Montalais called out at the noise made by the opening of the door, and, recognizing the king, made her escape. La Valliere rose from her seat, like a dead person galvanized, and then fell back in her armchair. The king advanced slowly towards her. "You wished for an audience, I believe," he said coldly. "I am ready to hear you. Speak." Saint Aignan, faithful to his character of being deaf, blind, and dumb, had stationed himself in a corner of the door, upon a stool which by chance he had found there. Concealed by the tapestry which covered the doorway, and leaning his back against the wall, he could thus listen without being seen, resigning himself to the post of a good watchdog, who patiently sits and watches without ever getting in his master's way. La Valliere, terror-stricken at the king's irritated aspect, rose a second time, and assuming a posture full of humility and entreaty, murmured, "Forgive me, sire." "What need is there for my forgiveness?" asked Louis. "Sire, I have been guilty of a great fault, nay, more than a great fault, a great crime." "You?" "Sire, I have offended your majesty." "Not in the slightest degree in the world," replied Louis. "I implore you, sire, not to maintain towards me that terrible seriousness of manner which reveals your majesty's just anger. I feel I have offended you, sire, but I wish to explain to you how it was that I have not offended you of my own accord." "In the first place," said the king, "in what way can you possibly have offended me? I cannot perceive how. Surely not on account of a young girl's harmless and very innocent jest. You turn the credulity of a young man into ridicule. It was very natural to do so. Any other woman in your place would have done the same." "Oh, your majesty overwhelms me by your remark." "Why so?" "Because, if I had been the author of the jest, it would not have been innocent." "Well, is that all you have to say to me in soliciting an audience?" said the king, as though about to turn away. Thereupon La Valliere, in an abrupt and broken voice, her eyes dried up by the fire of her tears, made a step towards the king, and said, "Did your majesty hear everything?" "Everything? What?" "Everything I said beneath the royal oak?" "I did not lose a syllable." "And now, after your majesty really heard all, are you able to think I abused your credulity?" "Credulity, yes, indeed, you have selected the very word." "And your majesty did not suppose that a poor girl like myself might possibly be compelled to submit to the will of others?" "Forgive me," returned the king, "but I shall never be able to understand that she who, of her own free will, could express herself so unreservedly beneath the royal oak, would allow herself to be influenced to such an extent by the direction of others." "But the threat held out against me, sire." "Threat? Who threatened you? Who dared to threaten you?" "Those who have the right to do so, sire." "I do not recognize anyone as possessing the right to threaten the humblest of my subjects." "Forgive me, sire, but near your majesty even, there are persons sufficiently high in position to have, or to believe that they possess, the right of injuring a young girl without fortune and possessing only her reputation." "In what way injure her?" "In depriving her of her reputation by disgracefully expelling her from the court." "Oh, Mademoiselle de la Valliere," said the king bitterly, "I prefer those persons to exculpate themselves without incriminating others." "Sire!" "Yes, and I confess that I greatly regret to perceive that an easy justification, as your own would have been, is now complicated in my presence by a tissue of reproaches and imputations against others." "And which you do not believe?" exclaimed La Valliere. The king remained silent. "Nay, but tell me," repeated La Valliere vehemently. "I regret to confess it," repeated the king, bowing coldly. The young girl uttered a deep groan, striking her hands together in despair. "You do not believe me, then? she said to the king, who remained silent, while poor La Valliere's features became visibly changed at his continued silence.
Therefore, you believe, she said, that I prearranged this ridiculous, this infamous plot of trifling in so shameless a manner with your majesty.
Nay, said the king, it was neither ridiculous nor infamous. It was not even a plot, merely a jest, more or less amusing, and nothing more.
Oh, murmured the young girl, the king does not and will not believe me, then?
No, indeed, I will not believe you, said the king. Besides, in point of fact, what can be more natural? The king, you argue, follows me, listens to me, watches me. The king wishes, perhaps, to amuse himself at my expense. I will amuse myself at his, and as the king is very tender-hearted, I will take his heart by storm. La Valliere hid her face in her hands as she stifled her sobs. The king continued pitilessly. He was revenging himself upon the poor victim before him for all he had himself suffered. Let us invent, then, a story of my loving him and preferring him to others. The king is so simple and so conceited that he will believe me, and then we can go and tell others how credulous the king is, and can enjoy a laugh at his expense.
Oh, exclaimed La Valliere, you think that? You believe that? It is frightful.
And, pursued the king, that is not all. If this self-conceited prince take our jest seriously, if he should be imprudent enough to exhibit before others anything like delight at it, well, in that case, the king will be humiliated before the whole court, and what a delightful story it will be, too, for him to whom I am really attached. In fact, part of my dowry for my husband, to have the adventure to relate of the monarch who was so amusingly deceived by a young girl.
Sire,
exclaimed La Valliere, her mind bewildered, almost wandering indeed.
Not another word, I implore you. Do you not see that you are killing me?
A jest, nothing but a jest, murmured the king, who, however, began to be somewhat affected. La Valliere fell upon her knees, and that so violently that the sound could be heard upon the hard floor.
Sire, she said, I prefer shame to disloyalty.
What do you mean? Inquired the king, without moving a step to raise the young girl from her knees.
Sire, when I shall have sacrificed my honor and my reason both to you, you will perhaps believe in my loyalty. The tale which was related to you in Madame's apartments, and by Madame herself, is utterly false, and that which I said beneath the great oak,
well,
that is the only truth.
What? Exclaimed the king.
Sire,
exclaimed La Valliere, hurried away by the violence of her emotions,
were I to die of shame on the very spot where my knees are fixed, I would repeat it until my latest breath. I said that I love you, and it is true. I do love you.
You?
I have loved you, sire, from the very first day I ever saw you, from the moment when, at Blois, when I was pining away my existence, your royal looks, full of light and life, were first bent upon me. I love you still, sire. It is a crime of high treason, I know, that a poor girl like myself should love her sovereign, and should presume to tell him so. Punish me for my audacity, despise me for my shameless immodesty, but do not ever say, do not ever think that I have jested with or deceived you. I belong to a family whose loyalty has been proved, sire, and I, too, love my king.
Suddenly her strength, voice, and respiration ceased, and she fell forward, like the flower Virgil alludes to, which the scythe of the reaper severed in the midst of the grass. The king, at these words, at this vehement entreaty, no longer retained any ill will or doubt in his mind. His whole heart seemed to expand at the glowing breath of an affection which proclaimed itself in such noble and courageous language. When, therefore, he heard the passionate confession, his strength seemed to fail him, and he hid his face in his hands. But when he felt La Valliere's hands clinging to his own, when their warm pressure fired his blood, he bent forward, and, passing his arms round La Valliere's waist, he raised her from the ground and pressed her against his heart. But she, her drooping head fallen forward on her bosom, seemed to have ceased to live. The king, terrified, called out for Saint Aignan. Saint Aignan, who had carried his discretion so far as to remain without stirring in his corner, pretending to wipe away a tear, ran forward at the king's summons. He then assisted Louis to seat the young girl upon a couch, slapped her hands, sprinkled some Hungary water over her face, calling out all the while, "Come, come, it is all over. The king believes you and forgives you. There, there now, take care, or you will agitate his majesty too much. His majesty is so sensitive, so tender-hearted. Now, really, Mademoiselle de la Valliere, you must pay attention, for the king is very pale." The fact was, the king was visibly losing color, but La Valliere did not move. "Do pray recover," continued Saint Aignan. "I beg, I implore you, it is really time you should. Think only of one thing, that if the king should become unwell, I should be obliged to summon his physician. What a state of things that would be! So do pray rouse yourself, make an effort, pray do, and do so at once, my dear." It was difficult to display more persuasive eloquence than Saint Aignan did, but something still more powerful, and of a more energetic nature than this eloquence, aroused La Valliere. The king, who was kneeling before her, covered the palms of her hands with those burning kisses, which are to the hands what a kiss upon the lips is to the face. La Valliere's senses returned to her. She languidly opened her eyes, and, with a dying look, murmured,
"Oh, sire, has your majesty pardoned me, then?"
The king did not reply, for he was still too much overcome. Saint Aignan thought it was his duty again to retire, for he observed the passionate devotion which was displayed in the king's gaze. La Valliere rose.
"And now, sire, that I have justified myself, at least I trust so, in your majesty's eyes, grant me leave to retire into a convent. I shall bless your majesty all my life, and I shall die thanking and loving heaven for having granted me 1 hour perfect happiness."
"No, no," replied the king. "You will live here, blessing heaven, on the contrary, but loving Louis, who will make your existence one of perfect felicity. Louis, who loves you, Louis, who swears it."
"Oh, sire, sire!"
And upon this doubt of La Valliere, the king's kisses became so warm that Saint Aignan thought it was his duty to retire behind the tapestry. These kisses, however, which she had not the strength at first to resist, began to intimidate the young girl.
"Oh, sire!"
she exclaimed.
"Do not make me repeat my loyalty, for this would show me that your majesty despises me still."
"Mademoiselle de la Valliere," said the king, suddenly drawing back with an air full of respect, "there is nothing in the world that I love and honor more than yourself, and nothing in my court, I call heaven to witness, shall be so highly regarded as you shall be henceforward. I entreat your forgiveness for my transport. It arose from an excess of affection, but I can prove to you that I love you more than ever by respecting you as much as you could possibly desire or deserve." Then, bending before her, and taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Will you honor me by accepting the kiss I press upon your hand?" And the king's lips were pressed respectfully and lightly upon the young girl's trembling hand. "Henceforth," added Louis, rising and bending his glance upon La Valliere, "henceforth you are under my safeguard. Do not speak to anyone of the injury I have done you. Forgive others that which they may have attempted. For the future, you shall be so far above all those that, far from inspiring you with fear, they shall be even beneath your pity." And he bowed as reverently as though he were leaving a place of worship. Then, calling to Saint Aignan, who approached with great humility, he said, "I hope, comte, that Mademoiselle de la Valliere will kindly confer a little of her friendship upon you in return for that which I have vowed to her eternally." Saint Aignan bent his knee before La Valliere, saying, "How happy, indeed, would such an honor make me!" "I will send your companion back to you," said the king. "Farewell, or rather, adieu, till we meet again. Do not forget me in your prayers, I entreat."
"Oh!" cried La Valliere, "be assured that you and heaven are in my heart together."
These words of Louise elated the king, who, full of happiness, hurried Saint Aignan down the stairs. Madame had not anticipated this denouement, and neither the Naiad nor the Dryad had breathed a word about it. End of chapter 59. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 60. The New General of the Jesuits. While La Valliere and the king were mingling, in their first confession of love, all the bitterness of the past,
the happiness of the present, and the hopes of the future, Fouquet had retired from the apartments which had been assigned to him in the chateau, and was conversing with Aramis precisely upon the very subjects which the king at that moment was forgetting.
"Now tell me," said Fouquet, after having installed his guest in an armchair and seated himself by his side, "tell me, Monsieur d'Herblay, what our position is with regard to the Belle Isle affair, and whether you have received any news about it." "Everything is going on in that direction as we wish," replied Aramis. "The expenses have been paid, and nothing has transpired of our designs." "But what about the soldiers the king wished to send there?" "I have received news this morning they arrived there 15 days ago." "And how have they been treated?" "In the best manner possible." "What has become of the former garrison?" "The soldiers were landed at Sarzeau, and then transferred immediately to Quimper." "And the new garrison?" "Belongs to us from this very moment." "Are you sure of what you say, my dear Monsieur de Vaux?" "Quite sure; and moreover, you will see by and by how matters have turned out." "Still, you are very well aware that, of all the garrison towns, Belle Isle is precisely the very worst." "I know it, and have acted accordingly. No space to move about, no gaiety, no cheerful society, no gambling permitted. Well, it is a great pity," added Aramis, with one of those smiles so peculiar to him, "to see how much young people at present day seek amusement, and how much, consequently, they incline to the man who procures and pays for their favorite pastimes." "But if they amuse themselves at Belle Isle?" "If they amuse themselves through the king's means, they will attach themselves to the king; but if they get bored to death through the king's means, and amuse themselves through Monsieur Fouquet, they will attach themselves to Monsieur Fouquet." "And you informed my intendant, of course, so that immediately upon their arrival—" "By no means; they were left alone a whole week, to weary themselves at their ease. But at the end of the week they cried out, saying that former officers amused themselves much better. Whereupon they were told that the old officers had been able to make a friend of Monsieur Fouquet, and that Monsieur Fouquet, knowing them to be friends of his, had from that moment done all he possibly could to prevent their getting wearied or bored upon his estates. Upon this they began to reflect. Immediately afterwards, however, the intendant added, that without anticipating Monsieur Fouquet's orders, he knew his master sufficiently well to be aware that he took an interest in every gentleman in the king's service, and that, although he did not know the newcomers, he would do as much for them as he had done for the others." "Excellent; and I trust that the promises were followed up. I desire, as you know, that no promise should ever be made in my name without being kept." "Without a moment's loss of time, our 2 privateers, and your own horses, were placed at the disposal of the officers. The keys of the principal mansion were handed over to them, so that they made up hunting parties and walking excursions with such ladies as are to be found in Belle Isle, and such other as they are enabled to enlist from the neighborhood, who have no fear of seasickness." "And there is a fair sprinkling to be met with at Sarzeau and Vannes, I believe, your eminence?" "Yes, in fact, all along the coast," said Aramis quietly. "And now, how about the soldiers?" "Everything precisely the same, in a relative degree. You understand. The soldiers have plenty of wine, excellent provisions, and good pay." "Very good. So that—" "So that this garrison can be depended upon, and it is a better one than the last." "Good." "The result is, if fortune favors us, so that the garrisons are changed in this manner only every 2 months, that, at the end of every 3 years, the whole army will, in its turn, have been there, and therefore, instead of having 1 regiment in our favor, we shall have 50,000 men." "Yes, yes, I knew perfectly well," said Fouquet, "that no friend could be more incomparable and invaluable than yourself, my dear Monsieur d'Herblay. But," he added, laughing, "all this time we are forgetting our friend Du Vallon. What has become of him? During the 3 days I spent at Saint Mande, I confess I had forgotten him completely." "I did not forget him, however," returned Aramis. "Porthos is at Saint Mande. His joints are kept well greased, the greatest care is being taken of him with regard to the food he eats and the wine he drinks.
I advise him to take daily airings in the small park, which you have kept for your own use, and he makes use of it accordingly. He begins to walk again. He exercises his muscular powers by bending down young elm trees, or making the old oaks fly into splinters, as Milo of Crotona used to do. And as there are no lions in the park, it is not unlikely we shall find him alive. Porthos is a brave fellow."
"Yes, but in the meantime he will get bored to death."
"Oh, no, he never does that."
"He will be asking questions?"
"He sees no one."
"At all events, he is looking or hoping for something or another."
"I have inspired in him a hope which we will realize some fine morning, and on that he subsists."
"What is it?"
"That of being presented to the king."
"Oh, in what character?"
"As the engineer of Belle Isle, of course."
"Is it possible?"
"Quite true."
"Shall we not be obliged, then, to send him back to Belle Isle?"
"Most certainly. I am even thinking of sending him as soon as possible. Porthos is very fond of display. He is a man whose weakness D'Artagnan, Athos, and myself are alone acquainted with. He never commits himself in any way. He is dignity himself. To the officers there, he seems like a paladin of the time of the Crusades. He would make the whole staff drunk without getting tipsy in the least himself, and everyone will regard him with admiration and sympathy. If, therefore, it should happen that we have any orders requiring to be carried out, Porthos is an incarnation of the order itself, and whatever he chose to do, others would find themselves obliged to submit to."
"Send him back, then."
"That is what I intend to do, but only in a few days, for I must not omit telling you one thing."
"What is it?"
"I begin to mistrust D'Artagnan. He is not at Fontainebleau, as you may have noticed, and D'Artagnan is never absent, or apparently idle, without some object in view. And now that my own affairs are settled, I am going to try and ascertain what the affairs are in which D'Artagnan is engaged."
"Your own affairs are settled, you say?"
"Yes."
"You are very fortunate in that case, then, and I should like to be able to say the same."
"I hope you do not make yourself uneasy."
"Hum."
"Nothing could be better than the king's reception of you."
"True."
"And Colbert leaves you in peace."
"Nearly so."
"In that case," said Aramis, with that connection of ideas which marked him, "in that case, then, we can bestow a thought upon the young girl I was speaking to you about yesterday."
"Whom do you mean?"
"What, have you already forgotten? I mean La Valliere."
"Ah, of course, of course."
"Do you object, then, to try and make a conquest of her?"
"In one respect only. My heart is engaged in another direction, and I positively do not care about the girl in the least."
"Oh, oh," said Aramis, "your heart is engaged, you say? The deuce! We must take care of that."
"Why?"
"Because it is terrible to have the heart occupied, when others, beside yourself, have so much need of the head."
"You are right. So you see, at your first summons, I left everything. But to return to this girl. What good do you see in my troubling myself about her?"
The king, it is said, has taken a fancy to her; at least, so it is supposed."
"But you, who know everything, know very differently."
"I know that the king is greatly and suddenly changed; that the day before yesterday he was crazy over Madame; that a few days ago Monsieur complained of it, even to the queen mother, and that some conjugal misunderstandings and maternal scoldings were the consequence."
"How do you know all that?"
"I do know it. At all events, since these misunderstandings and scoldings, the king has not addressed a word, has not paid the slightest attention to her royal highness."
"Well, what next?"
"Since then, he has been taken up with Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Now, Mademoiselle de la Valliere is one of Madame's maids of honor. You happen to know, I suppose, what is called a chaperon in matters of love. Well, then, Mademoiselle de la Valliere is Madame's chaperon. It is for you to take advantage of this state of things. You have no occasion for me to tell you that. But at all events, wounded vanity will render the conquest an easy one. The girl will get hold of the king and Madame's secret, and you can scarcely predict what a man of intelligence can do with a secret."
"But how to get at her?"
"Nay, you, of all men, to ask me such a question?" said Aramis.
Very true. I shall not have any time to take any notice of her.
She is poor and unassuming. You will create a position for her, and whether she tames the king as his lady confessor, or his sweetheart, you will have enlisted a new and valuable ally."
"Very good," said Fouquet. "What is to be done, then, with regard to this girl?"
"Whenever you have taken a fancy to any lady, Monsieur Fouquet, what course have you generally pursued?"
"I have written to her, protesting my devotion to her. I have added how happy I should be to render her any service in my power, and have signed Fouquet at the end of the letter."
"And has anyone offered resistance?"
"One person only," replied Fouquet; "but 4 days ago she yielded, as others had done."
"Will you take the trouble to write?" said Aramis, holding a pen towards him, which Fouquet took, saying,
"I will write at your dictation. My head is so taken up in one direction that I should not be able to write a couple lines."
"Very well," said Aramis, "write." And he dictated as follows:
"Mademoiselle, I have seen you, and you will not be surprised to learn I think you very beautiful. But for want of the position you merit at court, your presence there is a waste of time. The devotion of a man of honor, should ambition of any kind inspire you, might possibly serve as a means of display for your talent and beauty. I place my devotion at your feet, but as an affection, however reserved and unpresuming it may be, might possibly compromise this object of its worship, it would ill become a person of your merit running the risk of being compromised without her future being assured. If you would deign to accept and reply to my affection shall prove its gratitude to you in making you free and independent forever." Having finished writing, Fouquet looked at Aramis. "Sign it," said the latter. "Is it absolutely necessary?" "Your signature at the foot of that letter is worth 1,000,000. You forget that." Fouquet signed. "Now, by whom do you intend to send this letter?" asked Aramis. "By an excellent servant of mine." "Can you rely on him?" "He is a man who has been with me all my life." "Very well. Besides, in that case, we are not playing for very heavy stakes." "How so? For if what you say be true of the accommodating disposition of this girl for the king and Madame, the king will give her all the money she can ask for."
"The king has money, then?" asked Aramis.
"I suppose so, for he has not asked me for any more."
"Be easy, he will ask for some soon."
"Nay, more than that, I had thought he would have spoken to me about the fete at Vaux, but he never said a word about it."
"He will be sure to do so, though."
"You must think the king's disposition a very cruel one, Monsieur d'Herblay."
"It is not he who is so."
"He is young, and therefore his disposition is a kind one."
"He is young, and either he is weak or his passions are strong, and Monsieur Colbert holds his weakness and his passions in his villainous grasp."
"You admit that you fear him?"
"I do not deny it."
"In that case I am lost."
"Why so?"
"My only influence with the king has been through the money I commanded, and now I am a ruined man."
"Not so."
"What do you mean by 'not so'? Do you know my affairs better than myself?"
"That is not unlikely."
"If he were to request this fete to be given?"
"You would give it, of course."
"But where is the money to come from?"
"Have you ever been in want of any?"
"Oh, if you only knew at what cost I procured the last supply."
"The next shall cost you nothing."
"But who will give it me?"
"I will."
"What, give me 6 millions?"
10, if necessary."
"Upon my word, D'Herblay," said Fouquet, "your confidence alarms me more than the king's displeasure. Who can you possibly be, after all?"
"You know me well enough, I should think."
"Of course, but what is it you are aiming at?"
"I wish to see upon the throne of France a king devoted to Monsieur Fouquet, and I wish Monsieur Fouquet to be devoted to me."
"Oh!" exclaimed Fouquet, pressing his hand, "as for being devoted to you, I am yours entirely; but believe me, my dear D'Herblay, you are deceiving yourself."
"In what respect?"
"The king will never become devoted to me."
"I do not remember to have said that King Louis would ever become devoted to you."
"Why, on the contrary, you have this moment said so."
"I did not say the king, I said a king."
"Is it not all the same?"
"No, on the contrary, it is altogether different."
I do not understand you.
You will do so shortly, then. Suppose, for instance, that the king in question were to be a very different person to Louis XIV.
Another person?
Yes, who is indebted for everything to you.
Impossible.
His very throne, even.
You are mad, D'Herblay. There is no man living besides Louis XIV who can sit on the throne of France. I know of none, not one.
But I know one.
Unless it be Monsieur, said Fouquet, looking at Aramis uneasily. Yet Monsieur...
It is not Monsieur.
But how can it be that a prince not of the royal line, that a prince without any right...
My king, or rather your king, will be everything that is necessary. Be assured of that.
Be careful, Monsieur d'Herblay. You make my blood run cold and my head swim.
Aramis smiled. There is but a little occasion for that, he replied.
Again, I repeat, you terrify me, said Fouquet.
Aramis smiled.
You laugh, said Fouquet.
The day will come when you will laugh too, only at the present moment I must laugh alone.
But explain yourself.
When the proper time comes, I will explain all. Fear nothing. Have faith in me, and doubt nothing.
The fact is, I cannot but doubt, because I do not see clearly, or even at all.
That is because of your blindness, but a day will come when you will be enlightened.
Oh, said Fouquet, how willingly would I believe.
You without belief, you who, through my means, have 10 times crossed the abyss yawning at your feet, and in which, had you been alone, you would have been irretrievably swallowed, you without belief, you who from procureur general attained the rank of intendant, from the rank of intendant that of first minister of the crown, and who, from the rank of first minister, will pass to that of mayor of the palace? But no, he said, with the same unaltered smile, no, no, you cannot see, and consequently cannot believe, what I tell you. And Aramis rose to withdraw.
One more word, said Fouquet. You have never yet spoken to me in this manner. You have never yet shown yourself so confident. I should rather say so daring.
Because it is necessary, in order to speak confidently, to have the lips unfettered.
And now that is your case?
Yes.
Since a very short time, then?
Since yesterday only.
Oh, Monsieur d'Herblay, take care. Your confidence is becoming audacity.
One can well be audacious when one is powerful.
And you are powerful?
I have already offered you 10 millions. I repeat the offer.
Fouquet rose, profoundly agitated. Come, he said, come. You spoke of overthrowing kings and replacing them by others. If, indeed, I am not really out of my senses, is or is not that what you said just now?
You are by no means out of your senses, for it is perfectly true I did say all that just now.
And why did you say so?
Because it is easy to speak in this manner of thrones being cast down and kings being raised up, when one is oneself far above all kings and thrones, of this world at least.
Your power is infinite, then? cried Fouquet.
I have told you so already, and I repeat it, replied Aramis, with glistening eyes and trembling lips.
Fouquet threw himself back in his chair and buried his face in his hands. Aramis looked at him for a moment, as the angel of human destinies might have looked upon a simple mortal.
Adieu, he said to him. Sleep undisturbed, and send your letter to La Valliere. Tomorrow we shall see each other again.
Yes, tomorrow,
said Fouquet, shaking his hands like a man returning to his senses.
But where shall we see each other?
At the King's Promenade, if you like.
Agreed.
And they separated.